Here's some of the debate on the Defense Authorization Bill from the House Wednesday. Armed Services Committee Chair Mac Thornberry introduces the bill. This part of the debate is just over an hour.
Mr. Chairman, I am proud to bring before the House H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year 2018. It was reported favorably by the House Armed Services Committee at 11:59 p.m. on June 28, 2017, by a vote of 60-1. Now, that vote is an indication of the bipartisan support that exists to support our troops and to fulfill our obligations placed on us by the Constitution. Mr. Chairman, I think it's always helpful for us to remind ourselves of the authority by which we undertake our responsibilities. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that Congress has the power and the responsibility to provide and to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of land and naval forces, and, of course, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. The members of our committee and our staff take those responsibilities very seriously. This year, we seek to carry them out in a world which is as dangerous and complex as any of us have ever seen. One example from the news of the day is the alarming progress North Korea is making towards having an intercontinental ballistic missile that can carry nuclear weapons to our homeland. Now, we have, of course, a number of tools to use, including diplomacy and sanctions, but there is no substitute for military power. And I believe we must develop and deploy more of it to be ready to deal with these growing threats. And so the bill before us today substantially increases money for missile defense. So we are more capable of protecting our homeland against those ballistic missiles. It also increases funding for key munitions and for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance so we can have better visibility on what the adversary is doing. It increases the end strength for the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force just as they requested. And it funds more joint exercises with key allies in the Pacific. It boosts our shipbuilding budget to get more ships into the water faster and also cheaper. And so just as an example, Mr. Chairman, each of those items is important for dealing with this growing threat coming from North Korea. And we could sit here and go through a similar sort of discussion when it comes to Iran or the provocative actions of Russia and China or the terrorist organizations of various shades. Of course, we cannot guarantee that the capabilities that we will vote on in this bill will be available by the time the crisis comes. For unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, we are still dealing with defense budgets that were cut by more than 20% at a time when the threats around the world were growing. So we can't guarantee that these capabilities will be available when we need them, but what we can guarantee is if we don't fund these things now, they will not be available when we need them. So that is the priority given to this bill. Mr. Chairman, exactly 1 month ago, on June 12th, Secretary Mattis and Chairman Dunford testified before our committee, and I would like to read just one paragraph of the Secretary's testimony where he was comparing what the military was like when he left it and when he came back as Secretary. Secretary Mattis testified, and I'll quote, "4 years later, I returned to the department, and I have been shocked by what I've seen with our readiness to fight. For all the heartache caused by the loss of our troops during these wars, no enemy in the field has done more harm to the readiness of our military than sequestration. We have sustained our ability to meet America's commitments abroad because our troops have stoically shouldered a much greater burden." 4 years later, shocked, more harm by sequestration than the enemies in the field, and it's only because our folks are so incredible that they have borne an increasing burden. That's what the Secretary testified. Mr. Chairman, we have indisputably the finest military in the world, but it's also indisputable that it has been severely damaged by continuing resolutions, by sequestration, and by failure of the executive and legislative branches to adequately support the men and women out there on the front lines. We have an urgent need to begin to repair and rebuild our military. And I also believe, Mr. Chairman, it is fundamentally wrong to send men and women out on dangerous missions without providing them the best equipment, in the best shape, with the best training that our country can possibly provide. This bill, if followed by matching appropriation, takes a significant step toward meeting that objective to support those troops. It also makes major reforms in the way the Pentagon does business. Among other reforms, it enables the military to buy commercial products through online sites such as Amazon, Staples, and Grainger. We require life cycle maintenance costs to be considered at the beginning of a program, as must intellectual property rights, to maximize competition in the maintenance and repairs. Oversight into service contracts is increased, and there is much more, of course, in the bill. Mr. Chairman, this bill is the vehicle by which we, usually for 55 years at least, fulfill our responsibilities under the Constitution that I mentioned, to provide for the common defense. I believe that's the first job of the federal government. And I want to just express my appreciation to each of the members of our committee. Each of them has contributed to the product before us. Each of them takes their responsibilities under the Constitution very seriously. No one more so than the ranking member, Mr. Smith of Washington. We don't always agree on the judgment calls about issues, but I have no doubt that he, among the other, and all the members of the committee, try to do what's right for the country and put the interests of our troops first. That's exactly the attitude that we must follow, I think, on the floor over the next 3 days as we go through the amendments which we will consider. I also want to express appreciation to the committee and personal staff who have worked on this bill. It's been a challenging year for a variety of reasons, but as I started, I will finish. I am proud of this product. I hope it will gain the support of the entire House, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself 5 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, I want to thank the chairman, first of all, for his hard work on this bill and all the members of the committee and the staff. As the chairman has pointed out, this is a bill that we've passed for 55 straight years. It is a long and complicated bill that essentially sets the defense and national security policy for our country. And there is a lot of good work that has gone into this bill. And again, I thank the members for doing that. They recognize the complex threat environment that the chairman correctly described, and we are attempting to address it as best we can in this very difficult environment. And I think that the thing that is most difficult that I really want to emphasize is what the chairman said in the middle of his remarks, that over the past 6 years, we have had one government shutdown, a number of continuing resolutions, several threatened government shutdowns, and the unpredictability that that has presented to the Defense Department. Now, to be clear, it has also presented a fair amount, the same amount of unpredictability to the non-defense discretionary budget that also has to deal with those challenges. But that uncertainty about our budget has made it very difficult to plan, and nowhere is that more important than at the Department of Defense. As they try to lay out a strategy for national security, not knowing from 1 month to the next how much money you're going to have or what you're going to be able to spend it on is a huge problem. And I'll say a little bit more about this later, because as big a problem as that is, we haven't solved it. As we debate this bill here today, we do not have a budget resolution from either the House or the Senate. So this is a problem we still need to work on. You know, how much ever money we wind up spending on defense, if we had a cohesive plan and a clear idea of how much money we were going to have over the next few years, it would be a lot easier to plan for those contingencies. Again, I do want to compliment the work that's been done in this bill. Particularly, I focus a lot on unconventional threats. I think that is the changing nature of the the world. I used to chair what is now called the Emerging Threats Committee. I want to thank Congresswoman Stefanik and Ranking Member Langevin for their work on focusing on cyber, focusing on supporting our special operation forces that have borne so much the brunt of the fight that we face in countering terrorism. I also want to thank Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Cooper for their work on the Strategic Subcommittee focusing on space in particular, on the importance of emphasizing that. For a long time, our country dominated space, didn't have to worry about it. But now a lot of other countries are catching up and competing with us, sorry. I think this bill reflects the importance of that. So there are a lot of very solid things in this bill, but I want to close by emphasizing two significant problems that we still need to address. One, I mentioned already. We don't have a budget resolution. This bill has $621 billion in it, as I understand it, in the base bill, and another, I believe, $75 billion in the Overseas Contingency Fund. So we're spending nearly $700 billion in this bill on defense. That's a lot of money, and the chairman mentioned a lot of the very necessary programs that that's going towards. However, that breaks the budget caps. In order to break the budget caps, the House and the Senate have to vote to break the budget caps. It's July. We haven't done that. And I will emphasize that in the Senate, it actually requires 60 votes to break the budget caps. So as much as I see the need in defense, given the complex threat environment out there, it is very possible that $72 billion of what is in this bill is going to disappear between now and the end of this year, unless we address the broader issue of sequestration and budget caps. And I'll also emphasize that addressing that issue by gutting funding for the non-defense discretionary budget and plussing up defense is not going to work for a couple of reasons. Number one, a lot of the national security needs that we have come out of some of those other items. The proposal to cut the State Department by 31% in a time when we face the complex threat environment that was described is ridiculous. In fact, I will quote Chairman Mattis as well, who said, if you're going to cut the State Department by 30%, you better give me 5 more divisions because I'm going to need them. We're not going to be able to resolve conflicts in a peaceful way. And also, of course, we have domestic needs that are very important as well. We're still waiting on the infrastructure package from the administration. So there are a lot of needs that are not being met, and we are not yet voting to bust the budget caps. Here we have a bill that does that, but this House has to step up and take that vote if this defense authorizing bill is going to go forward. Second and final point, we still don't have a national security strategy from the White House. Now, we have a very complex threat environment, as I've said more often than I meant to during the course of the last few minutes. We do. We've got Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, a variety of terrorist threats. And what we've heard in our committee for the last 6 months is a series of people from the Pentagon coming over and basically saying the house is on fire. We don't have enough money to do fill in the blank, a whole lot of different things. What we haven't heard is a strategy. And the most disturbing conversation I had in that regard was with someone from the Office of Net Assessment, who I yield myself an additional minute.
Gentleman is recognized.
Who explained to me that, we laid out a strategy in 2012 and said we do not have the money to fund that strategy right now. So I asked him, well, how short are you? How much more money do you need? He looked at me like he didn't understand what I was asking, so I sort of explained it. And short answer, he didn't know. How can he not know? I mean, if you can sit there confidently and say, my gosh, we don't have enough money, we're way crazy short of our 2012 strategy, and you still can't say how short, then you don't have a strategy. So we need a strategy to make sure that this money is spent wisely. I'll close with a compliment of the chairman for something that he has done. We should also not assume that simply spending more money at the Department of Defense is necessarily going to make us safer. We have to make sure we spend it efficiently and effectively. I think this bill has a lot of very solid efforts to try to make us do that, towards acquisition reform, towards spending the money more wisely. So it's not just a matter of spending more money. We got to spend it smarter, and we've got to confront the lack of a strategy, and we've got to confront the fact that we still have not resolved our budget resolution problem. And with that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Readiness, Mr. Wilson of South Carolina.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mac Thornberry for his determined leadership to promote peace through strength. I'm grateful to support H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleague and ranking member, Congresswoman Madeline Badillo of Guam, for her tireless efforts and participation in this process, and also thank the Readiness Subcommittee members of the House Armed Services Committee on both sides of the aisle for bipartisan input for this bill. The creation of the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act truly was bipartisan. Mr. Chairman, over the past several months, we've heard testimony from every military service branch about the urgent need to address the alarming readiness shortfalls. Their testimonies were sobering, confirming Congress must take bold action. Here today, we have the responsibility of reducing the risk to our service members by making sure they are well-trained, supported, and that the equipment they use is properly maintained and combat ready. There are numerous important readiness provisions in the authorization, including adding over $2 billion to long-neglected facility sustainment, restoration, and modernization accounts, gives the Department of Defense more responsive facility constructive repair and real estate authorities for more efficient use of DoD resources, extends multiple temporary hiring authorities to allow the Department of Defense to fill critical manpower gaps, in particular in our defense industrial base, our depots, arsenals, and shipyards. None of the readiness provisions are arbitrary. They're specifically targeted to stop and as much as possible to reverse the decline of the readiness of our armed forces so we can continue to combat and deter the threats of national security around the world. I strongly support H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018, and encourage my colleagues in the House to support it as well. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 3 minutes to the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Tactical Air and Land Forces, the gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Tsongas.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. 2 weeks ago, the Armed Services Committee advanced the fiscal year 18 National Defense Authorization Act to the House floor with broad bipartisan support. And I'd like to thank Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith for their work in developing this year's bill. I'd also like to thank Congressman Mike Turner, Chairman of the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee, of which I am the ranking member, for his leadership and spirit of bipartisanship this year. This year's bill includes investments to fill genuine readiness needs and funding that is critical to ensuring that our men and women in uniform have the best cutting-edge resources and best equipment possible to keep them safe when defending our nation. I was encouraged that the bill we have passed out of committee directs the Defense Department to provide specific updates and reports on a number of programs and platforms so that we can robustly conduct our oversight responsibility on behalf of the American people. However, as we consider the bill on the floor today and in the coming days, I remain concerned about how we fund these needs. Substantial budget increases for the Department of Defense at the expense of other vital national programs undermines investments in our national competitiveness and the future of our country, and I believe makes us less secure over the long term. Providing our men and women in uniform with the resources they need to carry out their mission is one of our most solemn obligations. But we must also fund these resources responsibly in order to safeguard our economic vitality and our national security. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the chair of the Subcommittee on Tactical Air and Land Forces, gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. I have the privilege of serving as the chairman of the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee, and I want to particularly thank my subcommittee's ranking member, Ms. Nikki Tsongas, for her support in completing the markup of the bill, and as well as her hard work and as the bipartisan work that we've done together on the issue of sexual assault for the military. I appreciate her leadership in that. I strongly support this bill and can't emphasize enough Chairman Thornberry's steadfast leadership in raising the top line in this bill. This bill recommends $631 billion, a significant and needed increase over the original budget request. It supports both the base and unfunded requirements, which totaled over $30 billion. Without Chairman Thornberry's leadership, this number would not be sufficient. we are presenting a budget that helps rebuild the readiness of our forces. This increased base funding will begin to rebuild full-spectrum readiness from years of deferred modernization brought on by the previous administration. Within the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee jurisdiction, this bill authorizes over $12 billion in additional funds to address critical unfunded modernization requirements identified by the services. The bill recognizes the importance of land forces in current and future operations and authorizes over $2 billion to accelerate Armor Brigade combat team modernization to include additional Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. The bill addresses strike fighter capability and capacity shortfalls and authorizes another $2 billion in additional funding to secure additional F-35 strike fighters and F-18 Super Hornets to address unfunded requirements for the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. I'm also pleased that this bill supports the European Defense Initiative, the Deterrence Initiative, using OCO and addressing the needs of our European allies. This bill contains language from the Be Heard sexual assault bill that I worked with Representative Tsongas about, that we introduced in June, and I'm very proud that we continue to advance to protect the cause of protecting our service members from sexual assault. I'm also pleased to note that the Evans Law is included in this bill. This bill will ensure that the Department of Defense implements military residential window safety measures to protect against unintentional falls by young children.
Gentleman's time's expired.
With that, I urge my colleagues to support the National Defense Authorization Act. Thank you.
The gentleman from Texas Reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am now pleased to yield 3 minutes to the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Readiness, the gentlelady from Guam, Ms. Brodalo.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I would first like to commend Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and the committee staff who have worked many long nights on the FY18 National Defense Authorization Act. While there are very real questions about the top-line number, and I believe it would be inappropriate and reckless to have any additional funding come off the backs of non-defense spending, this is an important step forward in rebuilding our military readiness. This bill includes additional operations and maintenance funding to support more combat training center rotations and needed investment in the facilities, sustainment, restoration, and modernization accounts, providing more training opportunities and better maintenance facilities to live, work, and operate in. However, readiness cannot be bought back in a year, and these targeted investments must continue. Furthermore, the bill provides authorities to right-size civilian personnel shortfalls that have stressed maintenance backlogs at our shipyards and our depots. It also will make more effective the Department of Quarterly Readiness Report and raise the minor military construction threshold and clarify unspecified projects to provide additional flexibility to the department. I would especially like to thank Chairman Thornberry for following through on his commitment last year to work with me to include my provision that would help address critical workforce shortages affecting military construction and health care essential to the military buildup on Guam. And I also thank our ranking member, Smith, and Readiness Subcommittee Chairman Joe Wilson for working with me on this issue and on this bill. I look forward to continuing to work together to protect the full intent of this legislation. The readiness portion of this bill also includes provisions to support ship repair in the Western Pacific, as well as full funding for critical military construction projects. Given our posture, our strategic needs and challenges in the region, it is essential that we continue to sufficiently resource and support an active and engaged Indo-Asia-Pacific force. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle as this process continues. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend Vicki Plunkett for her over 2 decades of service in the House of Representatives and 10 years on the House Armed Services Committee. And I ask that my full remarks on her contributions be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the chair of our Subcommittee on Strategic Forces, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to thank the Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith for their leadership in bringing this year's NDAA. I'd also like to thank my friend and colleague from Tennessee, Mr. Jim Cooper, the ranking member on our subcommittee, for being such a great partner as we've worked on this important bill. Now I'd like to focus on some key provisions in the bill. First, space reform. This bill takes 2 monumental steps to reform national security space. First, the bill provides for the creation of a Space Corps within the Air Force to fix the fragmented space acquisition process. Second, it provides for the establishment of a subordinate, unified command for space under U.S. Strategic Command to ensure integration of the Joint Command of all space operations. I can't stress enough the urgent necessity of these reforms. Our society and our military are enormously dependent on space. Meanwhile, our adversaries continue to grow their counterspace capabilities. These adversaries have already reorganized their space forces toward the goal of neutralizing our advantage in space. Multiple studies going back almost 2 decades have recommended a space force to fix our space acquisition and management problems. Regardless, the DoD and the Air Force have yet to fix the problem. Decision-making authorities for space acquisitions remain fragmented across over 60 organizations. This bill would consolidate acquisition authority and improve our ability to jointly operate in space. Earlier this week, I returned from Asia, where I got to meet with our troops on the Korean Peninsula. I was in theater when North Korea conducted their intercontinental ballistic missile. We must be vigilant when it comes to our missile defenses, and this year's NDAA does that. Noteworthy initiatives in the bill include the authorization of approximately $2 billion in additional funds for the Missile Defense Agency. It also accelerates our efforts to develop space-based sensor and interceptor capabilities. Lastly, the bill supports our nuclear deterrence and includes provisions to improve the oversight of our nuclear command, control, and communications. I urge support of this important legislation and yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
The gentleman is recognized. Without objection.
Thank you. I want to thank the ranking member for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin by thanking Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith and Chairwoman Stefanik for their collective efforts in crafting this bill that's before us this evening. I'd also like to thank the staff who worked tirelessly on this productive and forward-thinking legislation. So it's an honor and a privilege to serve as a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee on behalf of the selfless servicemen and women who protect our nation every day, and I'm proud of the bipartisan, very strong bipartisan effort represented by this year's NDAA. So, Mr. Speaker, we accomplished a number of important objectives in this bill. First of all, we enhance our deterrence capabilities in Europe and support our nation's submarine force. We're very proud of the Virginia-class submarines that we build, starting right in my district, and we also provide the strong support for the Columbia-class program that will be the Ohio replacement program. We also make it clear that climate security is indeed national security, backing the Department in its efforts to build resilience, reduce risk, and prepare for all types of threats that may come our way, even if those threats come from climate change. But as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities, I'm particularly proud of the provisions we've included on cybersecurity, special operations, and research and development. We've strengthened our cyber cooperation with our partners and allies through both training and collaboration with the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. We better leverage the U.S. Global Engagement Center to combat propaganda and information warfare operations conducted against America and her allies. And we grant permanent authority for family support programs within Special Operations Command that reflect the unique needs of these warfighters and their families. We also reinvigorate the DoD scholarship program so that students are encouraged to pursue information security degrees and can come to work defending our nation from the get-go. We can have all the cyber policies in place that we want, but if we don't have the trained workforce to execute those policies, we're going to be behind the curve, and this helps to close that gap. We advance hypersonic weapons research, development, and especially transition efforts. We prioritize the readiness of U.S. Cyber Command and our Cyber Mission Force, and we strengthen congressional oversight of sensitive cyber military operations and command cyber warfare tools and capabilities. This approach was deliberate in nature, and it moves us closer to a military that will be able to address the variety of threats that we face in the 21st century. Again, I'd like to thank Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith and Chairwoman Stefanik and all of my colleagues on the House Armed Services Committee, as well as the staff, for their hard work on this very important bill. Again, I thank all those involved, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chair of the Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of H.R. 2810, the FY18 National Defense Authorization Act, but I continue to be surprised at some of the national security pundits who believe that a diminished force structure will improve our national security. Some have questioned whether we should fully fund national defense. Some have even questioned whether we should continue to expand our armed services to meet the strategic challenges posed by rising China and Russia, by an unpredictable North Korea, and a belligerent Iran. Mr. Chairman, our time is up. The time of action is now. The focus of our nation is upon us to provide for our national security. And I am pleased that we appear to have turned the tide in properly resourcing the requirements of our armed services. And I'm pleased that we are authorizing the funding to match our strategy and providing what our combatant commanders need to win any future conflicts. And I'm pleased that we have acknowledged the importance of our service members and the hardships that they endure so that we can enjoy our free and democratic society. In reference to the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee, I believe that we have reversed a trend towards a diminishing Navy and are tracking toward a strengthened 355-ship fleet. The bill expands on the 8 ships requested by the administration and adds an additional 5 ships. The bill also recommends additional advanced procurement for aircraft carriers and attack submarines while fully funding the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine and the B-21 Raider bomber programs. As to aircraft, the bill recommends an expansion of KC-46As, C-130Js, E-2Ds, and P-8s. Finally, the bill delivers the right authorities that will save the Department of Defense billions, yes, billions of dollars. Additionally, I want to recognize our ranking member, Joe Courtney. He has done extraordinary work and has been a true partner in this journey and continues to work on a collaborative, bipartisan basis to deliver the best for our national security. I continue to be impressed with the results that can be achieved when a subcommittee and the full committee focuses on a common goal and works to achieve bipartisan results. And I urge my colleagues to support the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 3 minutes to the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Military Personnel, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spiger.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his outstanding leadership and candor on our committee. I want to give a special shout out to our chairman, Mr. Thornberry, who shaved an hour and a half off our deliberations a couple of weeks ago by bringing us into the 21st century and laptops to look at our amendments. So a great improvement. I also want to thank my Chairman Mike Hoffman, for his leadership. We have worked well together, and I look forward to continuing that relationship, and also to a top-notch staff. This bill includes provisions that will provide the military services flexibility to recruit and retain members of our armed services and continues our commitment to taking care of our military families. The NDAA continues funding for DoD impact aid for schools with large numbers of military-connected families and authorizes reimbursement up to $500 for military spouses' expenses related to obtaining a professional license or certification when moving to a new state. The committee continues to provide oversight of important programs in the bill requiring reviews to ensure the morale, welfare, and recreation programs are properly funded and to require levels and the Department of Defense's debt collection practices are fair and do not place undue burdens on service members or their families. The bill includes the Private Act, which I co-sponsored with Congresswoman Martha McSally and other members of the committee to prohibit the wrongful broadcast or distribution of intimate visual images and ensure the military services have the tools to prosecute those who violate the law. The bill also provides support for victims of sexual assault by mandating training for Special Victims Counsel to recognize and address unique challenges often faced by male victims of sexual assault. I'm pleased that the bill continues the committee's efforts to assist those with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, as well as ensuring families are educated on suicide factors that are often associated with TBI or post-traumatic stress. However, as Ranking Member Smith has said, this NDAA fails to make the hard choices and trade-offs that are expected of us. The NDAA goes beyond the President's request to provide 2.4% pay raises for our servicemen and women at an additional cost of $200 million, an expense simply added to the top line. The NDAA also authorizes an increased end strength for the Army at a cost of $4 billion, again, simply adding it to the top line. Certainly our troops deserve a pay raise, but the question that must be asked is, where is the money coming from? And on what basis are these decisions being made? Congress has not received a strategic plan from the Pentagon that would inform us on how large the military needs to grow. By just adding funding to the NDAA, Congress is not providing the stable, predictive funding the military needs. In order to do that, we need to address the big elephant in the room, the Sequestration and Budget Control Act caps. That was Thank you. Despite all these additions, the committee was unfortunately unable to find the required offsets to fund an extension to the Special Survivors Indemnity Allowance to ensure it does not expire in May 2018. This falls short of my strong desire shared by other members of the committee to permanently fix the survivor benefit compensation. This offset amounts to a shameful tax on over 60,000 surviving spouses who are already struggling emotionally and financially. While the SSIA extension would be an important temporary fix, Congress must make a permanent fix to offset, the offset. We cannot continue to allow surviving military spouses to suffer from our inaction. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, just to make 2 points. Number one, President Barack Obama was inaugurated in January 2009. The first national security strategy he submitted was in May of 2010, a year and a half later. So I don't think it's completely unreasonable that we haven't yet gotten the national security strategy from the new administration. Secondly, the pay raise for the troops is based on the statutory formula, which is related to the cost of living. That's where it comes from, and it seems to me to say, no, you don't really get what the formula says you deserve is not appropriate. Now, the administration did not request it, and the criticism from some is that we should not provide it. I think if the formula is wrong, we should change it, but if the formula says that's how much the cost of living's gone up, we should provide it. At this point, Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chair of the Subcommittee on Personnel, gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. The bill contains significant policy and funding initiatives that continue our commitment to maintain military personnel and family readiness and address issues important to our troops. The provisions contained in this bill provide our warfighters, retirees, and their families the necessary pay and benefits to sustain them in today's highly stressed force. To support these efforts, this bill establishes a fully funded by-law pay raise for all of our service members, overriding the President's ability to reduce the pay raise. After years of lower than by-law pay raise requests, it's critical that we continue to give our troops and their families the pay increases they deserve. Increases the in-strengths of our active duty, National Guard, and Reserve forces, increases mission readiness while reducing the stress and strain on the force and their families. Further focuses last year's management reform of the military health system to provide clear responsibility for the delivery of health care services at military medical treatment facilities and for military medical readiness. The bill also stops all ill-considered cost-saving measures that would close several U.S. military hospitals overseas. We believe our service members and their families should continue to have the best medical care possible wherever they serve. It also continues to improve sexual assault prevention and response by adding a new provision to the Uniform Code of Military Justice specifically prohibiting non-consensual sharing of intimate images, expanding special victim counsel training to include training on the unique challenges often faced by male victims and clarifying the process by which a designated representative can be appointed by a victim prior to a court-martial. Finally, service members returning to civilian life and their spouses are challenged by varying
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield additional 30 seconds to the gentleman.
The gentleman is recognized.
State licensure and certification requirements. Rather than imposing a single federal standard on the states, we provide a $500 reimbursement to defray these costs. We ask states to work with the Secretary of Defense to develop common standards where possible. In conclusion, I want to thank Ms. Spear and her staff for their contributions to the MARC and support in this process. Of course, we are joined by an active, informed, and dedicated group of subcommittee members. Their recommendations and priorities are clearly reflected in the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. Additionally, I appreciate the dedication and hard work of the subcommittee staff. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am now pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to commend the dedicated bipartisan work of the House Armed Services Committee and recognizing our subcommittee chairs, members, and the staff as well in bringing this critical bill to the floor. But as it's been stated earlier, the budget numbers that we're talking about contained in the bill are unfortunately aspirational. We have not passed a budget resolution, and the Budget Control Act is still the law of the land. While it is true that the BCA was a bipartisan failing, we can all take credit for that, pointing fingers does not solve the problems. We are on an uncertain and a dangerous path, one where we have not been honest with ourselves on many levels and where we continue to play games with our men and women serving in the military. We must recognize that the only path to solving these issues is bipartisan collaboration and legislation to repeal the BCA. Continuing resolutions and unrealistic, deeply partisan budgets amount to nothing more than professional malpractice. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that I was encouraged to see that the Senate included a proposal similar to the one I introduced during markup to continue paying the widows of service members who died in defense of our nation. Their personal compensation is not just a small gesture, but our fundamental responsibility. And I'm also encouraged by the promise our chairman made regarding this issue. He said, and I quote, that the issue has to be fixed, and it will be. But there are, as he acknowledged as well, and I quote, difficult trade-offs that have to be made. And I completely agree. We will all have to contribute to the solutions. I'm prepared to do that, and I know that my colleagues are as well. We all have to hope together that we move forward and be prepared to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight, gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. And I would like to thank Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith for bringing this important bill to the floor. As members of Congress, it's our responsibility to provide support for our men and women in uniform while they selflessly serve our nation. This bill takes significant steps to address our military's severe readiness crisis by ensuring that our troops have the resources, training, and capabilities needed to face the growing threats of today. As chairwoman of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, I'm proud of the provisions included in this bill to reform the foreign military sales process, provide funding to address the critical infrastructure needs of the U.S. nuclear security enterprise, and protect our nation's highly sensitive U.S. military information that our adversaries are actively seeking to exploit. This bill is good news for the warfighter. It authorizes 22 additional F-18 Super Hornets to help fill the Navy's strike fighter shortfall and fully funds the B-21 Raider, a critical platform needed to deter and defeat future aggression around the world. I'm proud to represent Missouri's 4th Congressional District, which is home to Whiteman Air Force Base and Fort Leonard Wood. This bill funds modernization programs for the B-2 Spirit and authorizes Phase 1 of a new hospital facility at Fort Leonard Wood. Since arriving to Congress, I've been fighting to address the infrastructure needs of our Army ammunition plants, like the one at Lake City, which is the sole source for our Army's small caliber ammo. These plants are in dire need of modernization, and this bill authorizes much-needed funding to help improve these deteriorating facilities. Thanks to the leadership of Chairman Thornberry, the Armed Services Committee increased defense spending to meet the needs of today's warfighter. I appreciate the opportunity to work with Ranking Member Seth Moulton and all committee members on this bill. I'm proud of the bipartisan fashion in which we work, and I urge my colleagues to support its passage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, let me start by thanking Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith, not only for their leadership, but the bipartisan, collaborative approach to the work of the committee. And certainly as a new member of the 115th Congress, I find that very refreshing. And from what I've seen, it's no surprise that 50-plus years in a row, we've successfully passed the NDAA. Mr. Speaker, the United States faces serious security threats, aggression from North Korea and Russia, long and costly campaigns in Afghanistan, Iraq, new battlefields in cyberspace and in outer space. After years of sequestration, there is consensus, certainly in the House Armed Services Committee, that Congress must address readiness shortfalls and modernization challenges facing our military. So, in the NDAA, we made greater investments in training and equipping the forces and prioritized projects that extend our technological and warfighting edge. But increasing defense authorizations and appropriations absent a clear national security strategy will not make our country safer. We need a smart, strategic approach to national security that provides clear goals and objectives and that incorporates an all-of-government approach. That means not only increasing defense spending, but also ensuring funding for the State Department and USAID and reversing proposed cuts to non-defense programs that make the world more stable and secure. We owe it to our servicemen and women to provide them with both the resources to accomplish their mission abroad and to pursue the American dream when they return home, and that's good schools, a family-supporting job, and safe neighborhoods. We cannot do one at the expense of the other. The long-term success of our country depends on that. And, Mr. Speaker, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chair of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities, gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I rise in strong support of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018, which increases readiness and ensures that those who serve our nation are fully equipped, trained, and supported. As the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities, I am especially proud of the oversight regarding stronger cyber warfare capabilities, safeguarding technological superiority, enabling our special operations forces around the globe, providing resources and authorities to counter terrorism and unconventional warfare threats, and energizing programs and activities that counter the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Our achievements in cybersecurity carry 3 broad themes. First, the bill increases congressional oversight of cyber operations by including a bill introduced by myself, Ranking Member Langevin, Chairman Thornberry, and Ranking Member Smith that will ensure Congress is kept fully informed of sensitive military cyber operations. Second, we bolster international partnerships for cyber warfare to counter aggressive adversaries, including efforts to counter and mitigate adversarial propaganda efforts and information warfare campaigns. And third, the bill continues to build and enhance our U.S. cyber warfare capabilities and activities. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, this bill reinforces counterterrorism and unconventional warfare capabilities by fully resourcing U.S. Special Operation Command's programs and activities and increasing congressional oversight of intelligence activities. Finally, I would like to thank Mr. Rogers, Chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, for including language that supports the decision for a future East Coast missile defense site. And I would like to thank Mr. Kaufman, Chairman of the Military Personnel Subcommittee, for including portions of my bill, the Lift the Relocation Burden from Military Spouses Act. And before I conclude, I would like to thank Chairman Mac Thornberry for his leadership, as well as my subcommittee ranking member, Congressman Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, for his bipartisan energy and cooperation on all of these issues. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 2810. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I inquire as to how much time is left on each side?
Washington is 9.5 minutes. The gentleman from Texas has 8 minutes.
Speaker, he's not here yet, so we're going to reserve for the moment.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to a valued member of the committee, a retired Air Force General, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in staunch support of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018. I served in the military under the past 5 presidents, starting with Ronald Reagan, and witnessed firsthand the erosion of our combat edge. When I joined the military, we outtrained our competitors with a 2-to-1 flying hour advantage. Today, we are lagging behind them in training, and it's unconscionable to send our warriors to fight without every possible advantage. We don't want a close fight, but that is where we're at today. As a general officer, I was charged with preparing our forces to prevail over any adversary, a nearly impossible task given the damage done by 22% reduction in the defense funding over the last 8 years while at war. This act will begin to right the ship with a 10% top-line increase, providing the means to rebuild readiness, deter aggression, and defeat adversaries. It invests in peace through strength. The Constitution charges this body with the power to provide for the common defense. For the Armed Services Committee, this is a solemn obligation rooted in 50 years of bipartisanship, and we meet this obligation with the 2018 NDAA. I urge support, and I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to another very valuable member of our committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Knight.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. This bill is a result of mindful deliberation and absolute dedication to our nation's soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. I'm proud to be standing here with fellow members of the Armed Services Committee and speak to the merits of this legislation. In particular, the acquisition reforms in this bill will help get proven advanced equipment in the hands of service members faster and for a better price. This bill brings much-needed innovation to the way defense acquisition personnel spend tax dollars and the way commercial businesses engage with the U.S. government. It prioritizes oversight of service contracts. This type of contract accounts for over 50% of DoD contract expenditures, which is up to now was unclear and unanalyzed. And it will help secure a better value for precious dollars spent through reforms in the contract auditing process. Small business industrial base is a critical part of DoD procurement. Our small businesses have unique ability to strengthen our contracting process by driving innovation and competition in the marketplace. It is important that we create opportunities for these contractors and strengthen entrepreneurial development programs that help eliminate barriers of entry and diversify our industrial base. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Washington continues to reserve.
Well, that depends. Mr. Courtney, you ready to go on a moment's notice here? I'll take that as a yes. With that, I'll yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut and the ranking member on the subcommittee on sea power and projection forces, Mr. Courtney.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Mr. Smith for yielding, and compliments to you and Chairman Thornberry for the outstanding work again that the two of you have collaborated on to keep this, really massive undertaking on schedule. Really a very truncated schedule this year, but you both did it. And again, it's really kudos to both of you in terms of your leadership skills. Mr. Chair, I rise in strong support of the 2018 NDAA. Front and center on the sea power subcommittee, which I served with Chairman Whitman, who's in his first term and did an outstanding job. But in our deliberations this year was the buildup of our Navy fleet, which has been a multi-year process of strategic planning. In December of last year, the prior Navy Secretary, Ray Mabus, who served in the prior administration, released an updated force structure assessment that laid out the requirement for increasing the Navy's fleet from 308 ships to 355. Then in January, Navy officials outlined a plan to get us on a path to a construction plan to get us on a path to a larger fleet. And in early May, the Chief of Naval Operations emphasized that time is of the essence in growing the Navy. The stage was set to get started on the larger fleet. And that was why so many of us were surprised on May 23rd and disappointed when the White House sent over basically a 308-ship budget for a 355-ship fleet. I am proud to say that on a bipartisan basis, we have done much better in this bill than the budget that came over. Among other things, the bill explicitly makes it the policy of our nation to achieve a 355-ship Navy, and we add 5 additional ships in 2018 for a total of 12 to get us moving towards the larger fleet that prior administration and the new administration know that we need. One area I'm particularly proud of is the area of our undersea forces. Reflecting the urgent testimony of our combatant commanders, our panel once again led the way in forging an aggressive but realistic plan to grow our submarine fleet. To achieve this, our bill authorizes multi-year procurement authority for 13 Virginia-class attack submarines for the next 5 years. Not only would this keep us at the 2-a-year level that we've been on for the last few years, but it would go even further by reaching a 3-submarine build rate in the coming years. The sea power portion of the bill does much, much more to support a range of priorities on the seas and in the skies, far too many to itemize here today. I will just say that I'm proud of the bipartisan contribution of all of our subcommittee members into the product before the House today, and again to Mr. Whitman for his first year as subcommittee chairman. And in particular, I want to highlight the work of our subcommittee staff in helping us craft the bill. I'm joined here today by one of my staff, Stephen Clement, who's been working with us and is going to be moving on to better things, and I want to publicly thank him for his outstanding work in terms of helping us get to the place we are here today. In closing, I would urge my colleagues to support the Defense Authorization Bill and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to a valuable member of our committee who continues to serve our nation in the reserves, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr.
recognized.
Chairman. I rise today to express my strong support for the fiscal year 2018 National Defense Authorization Act. As the most recently deployed veteran serving in Congress, serving in Afghanistan just 2 years ago, I know the national security challenges facing our country firsthand. While these challenges are not easily solved, this legislation represents a significant step forward. I want to take a moment and specifically thank Chairman Thornberry for his leadership and assistance to myself and other freshman members of the committee. Working together with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, the Armed Services Committee has crafted a bill focused on rebuilding and reforming the Department of Defense. By procuring what we need, fixing what we already have, and by being good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars by proposing new contract audit reforms, this bill begins the hard work of getting our department back on the right track. While we cannot control the existential threats facing our nation, we must ensure that those in uniform are ready to address those threats when necessary. Moreover, as this week's tragic C-130 accident that claimed the lives of 16 members reminded all Americans—
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield additional 30 seconds to the gentleman.
Thank you. Our service members, we know our service members place their lives on the line each and every day. From giving our troops a well-deserved raise to funding our vital missile defense programs, I believe that this legislation begins the process of rebuilding and reforming our military, so we are ready for whatever comes next. And with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
If I may inquire, I believe that is your last speaker. Are you prepared to close at this point? Okay. I yield myself the balance of our time.
The gentleman is recognized.
And what I really want to focus on is the budget problem, because that's really underlying all of this. I think we've heard a lot of good speeches from members talking about what is in this bill, how important it is, how what's in this bill is attempting both to meet our national security threats and, as importantly, to make sure that we take care of the men and women who serve our military, who fight to protect us, to make sure, first of all, that they and their families are taken care of from a financial standpoint, but also to make sure that they have the equipment and training that they need to be ready to fight the fights that we ask them to go to. And I think that's one of the great challenges, is whatever it is we decide ought to be our national security strategy, I think the thing that we can all agree on is that we need to make sure that we provide the training, equipment, and support so that the men and women who serve in the military are ready for that fight. The worst thing we can do is create a hollow force, set up an expectation, you need to do all of this, but we're only going to train you for that. So if this other stuff comes up, you're not going to be ready. We've talked about this a lot in our committee to make sure that we are ready for the fight that comes. And that's where the budget creates a very significant problem. Now, we've talked a lot about the Budget Control Act and sequestration. And, you know, it's pretty clear why we had the Budget Control Act and sequestration. I was here for it. We were days away from not raising the debt ceiling and basically not meeting our commitments to pay our bills. And there are those who figured that could be a significant problem. So we made an agreement. We were going to try to get the budget under control. Sequestration was put in place with the expectation that it wouldn't be implemented because we would come to a grand bargain on revenue and spending that would get our deficit under control. Well, we didn't, and sequestration kicked in. But as we sit here today, even if we got rid of sequestration, even if we got rid of the budget caps, we are still $20 trillion in debt. We're going to run a $700 billion deficit, and this is projected to go nowhere but up in the years ahead. I don't believe that is sustainable. Now, I don't think we need to balance the budget tomorrow or next year or even in the next 5 years, but we need to get ourselves on a sustainable path, and we flat refuse to do that. And when you look at, you don't see a lot of campaigns promising to cut specific programs or promising to raise taxes. And I love the fact that if you poll the American people, there is a very clear consensus on what they think we ought to do about this problem. First of all, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of them support a balanced budget. Now, by the way, not 5, 10 years, but right now. And then if you ask them, well, here's all the places where the government spends money, what would you like to cut? The answer to that question is nothing. I mean, literally nothing. The Pew Research folks do a poll on this every year, and every single category, a majority of people would rather keep the money the same or increase it as opposed to decrease it. And then, of course, if you ask them what taxes they would like to increase, by and large, they don't want to increase taxes. It's interesting. You can, if you can convince people that the taxes in question will not apply to them, for a brief moment they will be supportive of it. But then someone will come along and convince them that at some point it might apply to them, and then they oppose it. So our task as members of Congress is to balance the budget without raising taxes or cutting spending. That, of course, is impossible. So what we've chosen to do is put off that decision for as long as is humanly possible. And that is why we do not have a budget resolution. Because any budget resolution this body could create would fail on probably multiple fronts of what the public expects. It wouldn't balance the budget. It wouldn't cut enough. It would cut spending they didn't want to cut, and it would raise, well, probably wouldn't raise taxes coming from this majority, but if it did, it wouldn't be popular. So we have to start having an honest conversation about the budget. We hear in the Armed Services Committee all the time about all the needs, all the shortfalls, all the critical things we need to do, and we argue about it and argue about it. But in 6 years, the Republican majority has not put forward a plan to control mandatory spending. They say that's the problem, no plan to do that. Certainly they haven't even considered the possibility of increasing revenue. If we are this serious, and we should be, about making sure that we have the funds necessary to provide an adequate national security, then we should stop cowering from the budget debate. Personally, I'm all for raising taxes because I see the needs that the chairman and everybody else has described, and I am actually prepared to pay for them. So we need to do that. That overarching budget problem is what has put us in this mess. And as we talk about this bill, as I said, it's $72 billion over the budget caps. And unless we get a vote to lift those budget caps, which I just mentioned is politically unpopular, which is why we haven't done it for the full 6 months that we have been in session this year, then that $72 billion goes away, and the Pentagon is back in chaos. So this may be a good bill, it may be solid, it doesn't have the backing of the budget. And let me finally suggest that there are some things that the Department of Defense could do, and this is why the strategy is so important. Yes, the Obama administration waited until May of 2010. They didn't have 6 years of CRs and government shutdowns and threatened shutdowns and the changing threat environment that we have. They had a reasonably consistent set of problems. It was a set of problems, but they had the same Secretary of Defense from the previous administration. They had time to look at that. We need this strategy urgently, because the big question is, are we spending the money correctly? Is the Department of Defense spending money in the right way? Do we have a strategy to figure out how we should prioritize? We don't. And with this crushing budget environment, it is absolutely critical that we do. We need to consider the possibility, for instance, that we might be spending some money that we shouldn't be spending. I will often ask that question of the generals who come over and tell us how short they are of everything. I will say, well, where are we spending money, in your opinion, that we shouldn't be? They never answer the question. And you cannot tell me, in a $700 billion budget in a place as large as the Pentagon, that there isn't somebody over there who knows to say, look, we shouldn't be doing this. Just to give one suggestion, we've had the BRAC debate forever. We've had a shrinking military, yet we have maintained the same infrastructure. We've seen study after study from the Air Force and others about how much excess capacity they have and money that could be saved from doing that. But again this year, for I submit political reasons,
Gentleman's time's expired.
BRAC is prohibited. So we need to get a lot smarter about how we're going to spend this money and a lot smarter about our budget if this bill is actually going to become reality. And with that, I'm out of time, so I got nothing to yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, as usual, the gentleman from Washington makes a number of good points. We absolutely need to have national security based on a strategy and fund that strategy. There are many of us who would argue that is not what has happened in recent years. I would just point out it was not only President Obama, but also President Bush and President Clinton. None of them provided a national security strategy in the first year that they were in office. I have tremendous confidence in Secretary Mattis, among others on the national security team. I believe they are looking at these issues and will provide us with a strategy. The gentleman is also absolutely correct when he points out that the Defense Authorization Bill is only one step in the process. There are many more steps to come. I think we will have a budget on this floor to vote on shortly. I also expect that we're going to have appropriations to vote on at some point in the coming weeks. I also believe that we're going to have the opportunity to vote on dealing with the sequestration caps, which, by the way, the administration and I think most of us in the House, and I presume most in the other body as well, are in favor of doing away with, because they have not been successful in accomplishing the goal for which they were put in place. So there are clearly many more debates to have on other days. What we have this week on the floor before us is the Defense Authorization Bill. And it is our obligation to authorize the things that the military needs. And I want to go back to the point that Mr. Banks made a few minutes ago. These are life and death decisions. Our hearts break, our prayers go out to the families of the 15 Marines and the one sailor who lost their lives Monday of this week in the plane crash in Mississippi. Just as our hearts go out and our prayers continue for the family members of the 7 sailors who lost their lives off of Japan a few weeks ago. What it reminds us is exactly what Mr. Banks said. This is a dangerous business, even on training missions, even on routine deployments, and the men and women who volunteer to serve our country, to protect us, to secure our freedoms, deserve the very best our country can provide them. That's the goal of this bill, to support the men and women who serve us and to further the national security of the United States. You've heard from both sides of the aisle many good things that are in this bill. We're going to go through a lot of amendments over the next several days, but at the end of the day, the point is, even if the good, the bad, and the ugly that gets put in this bill, to support the men and women who serve by voting yes, and I hope my colleagues will do that. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Armed Services printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 1115-23, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the House Report 115-212 is adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as an original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part B of House Report 115-212 and amendments in block described in Section 3 of House Resolution 431. Each further amendment printed in Part B of the report shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and the opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. Pursuant to the order of the House of the day today, Amendment number 88 may be considered out of sequence. It shall be in order at any time for the chair of the Committee on Armed Services or his designee to offer amendments in block consisting of amendments printed in Part B of the report not earlier disposed of. Amendment in block shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Armed Services or their designees. Should not be subject to amendment and should not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment number 1 printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. For that purpose, the gentleman from Texas, for what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk shall designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Thornberry of Texas.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Thornberry, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The gentleman recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Just to say, Mr. Chairman, this is a manager's amendment that contains technical and conforming edits to the bill. I do not know of any controversy and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Purposes the gentleman seek recognition.
To claim the time in opposition, though, I am not opposed.
The gentleman is recognized for 10 minutes. 5 minutes, I'm sorry.
5, yeah, and I'm not going to take that much. I agree with the chairman. This is uncontroversial and should be adopted. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment number 2, printed in Part B of the House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Conaway of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. This amendment is a pretty straightforward amendment. It does two things. One, it saves and conserves valuable taxpayer dollars to be used in higher priority issues, and it holds the Department of Defense accountable for current law. Mr. Chairman, we currently have in place a variety of agreements with folks to buy biofuels at costs ranging up to $28 a gallon. The Army actually bought some at $40 a gallon. At a time when you've heard for over an hour now the need for conserving resources, for reprioritizing resources, having those kind of contracts, new contracts come into existence, makes no sense whatsoever. This amendment would simply say that while sequestration is going on, while we are under the draconian measures of sequestration, the Army and Department of Defense, Navy, Air Force will not enter into new contracts. Existing contracts, wherever they may be, however costly they might be, would continue forward. We would honor those and the commitments made in that regard. But as long as we're under sequestration and we're under this tight budgeting process that you've heard ad nauseum over the last hour or so, these would prevent this problem from going forward. Then if sequestration goes away on its own, or we somehow lift it ourselves, then this restriction would be lifted, and then new contracts could be entered into. But those contracts would then have an accounting clause in, or the accounting department at the Pentagon would have an accounting process in which the cost of the fuels would have to take into account all of the other agencies who've been contributing to this fund. Early on, there was a $510 million
pot of money created by Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and the Department of Agriculture, using the Commodities Credit Corporation to fund this $510 million. None of us know where that money went. We don't. It was supposed to do a refinery, but we don't know that. We can't prove that. We do know that they've bought jet fuel at $28 a gallon under this program. Normally, of that same time frame, they also bought jet fuel for $3.35 a gallon. So $25 a gallon differential, 2 million gallons bought at these higher prices. That's $51 million of taxpayer dollars that were, I believe, misapplied and misprioritized in these tough times. This program came to existence in no small part because of America's reliance on overseas sources of oil. This all predates the last 6 years of effort that's gone on in order to create the energy independence that we see on our horizon, given shale drilling and all the opportunity to use these cheaper fuels. So I ask my colleagues to support the amendment. It makes sense. It does not squander taxpayer resources. It does not affect existing contracts. It would only be for new contracts. The industry itself, of course, is going to be for it because they're selling a commodity at $28 a gallon versus $3 a gallon, and you'd expect them to be against my amendment. But my amendment is for the servicemen and women. It's for the taxpayers, and I encourage a yes vote, and I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purposes, gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Before I proceed, I wanted to take a quick few seconds to thank and recognize Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith. As a freshman member of the 115th Congress, it's been refreshing to see such bipartisan tone and leadership. So I just wanted to recognize them for those qualities and skills. With the Department of Defense struggling to rein in spending while keep our military strong and our country protected, it is amendments like Mr. Conaway's that are unnecessarily impeding cost competition and reductions that come with a public-private partnership. This amendment limits competition between alternative fuel sources and may even force DOD to pay more by explicitly prohibiting purchases of cheaper fuel. That is not only inefficient, it is irresponsible. The Department of Defense is the single largest energy consumer in the world. We should be incentivizing the diversification of liquid fuels as an option to bring down cost and reduce regulatory burden. Not only does this amendment risk increased costs for DOD procurement, but it also stunts potential economic growth in the rapidly expanding biofuel field, a billion-dollar industry worldwide. Yet another troubling result of this amendment, if passed, is its potential to impede military operations where an alternative fuel may be the only option available. It is unethical to endanger our men and women in uniform with this ban, and at the very least, a waiver should be included for national security matters. Military leaders and experts have told Armed Services Committee members time and time again about the direct threat that climate change, particularly sea level rise, poses to our military operations and installations, both at home in places like Norfolk and abroad. My colleague, Mr. Langevin, included language in this year's NDAA that specifically acknowledges this threat. It directs the Defense Department to study the impact of climate change and prepare an effective strategy to address its effects. We've long known that carbon pollution and fossil fuels are heavily contributing to a changing climate and the extreme weather patterns that accompany this phenomenon. It is irresponsible for this Congress to ignore this reality and not even consider cost-effective and more clean energy sources for our military. And finally, I would like to point out that this amendment is completely unnecessary. Current law already prohibits DOD from purchasing alternative fuel in large quantities unless it is cost competitive with traditional fuel. I urge my colleagues to oppose this misguided amendment that does far more harm than good to our Defense Department and to our service members. Mr. Speaker, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask how much time I have?
2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The gentleman is incorrect in the sense that this does not, over the next year or 2 or 3, however sequestration is going to be in place, measurably affect climate change one way or the other. The small amounts of fuel that are allowed to be purchased at in excess of competitive costs are 2 million gallons at $28 a gallon. The Department of Defense buys 107 billion gallons of fuel. And so any number up to some multi-million dollar number, a million gallon amount, could be hidden under this amount. We also don't have a good accounting process to understand exactly what those costs are when they enter these contracts, and asking the Department of Agriculture to subsidize this process doesn't make any sense either. In order to hide from the program, the Department of Defense buys the fuel, they send the bill to the Commodities Credit Corporation to actually pay for it. So it's not even on the Department of Defense's books and records to get the proper accounting to make sure. This is straightforward stuff. You can't, on the one hand, argue that we need to provide all that needs to be provided for our men and women to fight, and spend an extra $51 million plus the $510 million that we don't know where that went on a product that can be bought for $3.35 a gallon. I would argue there's nowhere in the world today where we need drop-in jet fuel that could just be provided somewhere else. That argument is spacious and makes no sense whatsoever. That may be some future issue, but that is not today. Given the shale drilling and the opportunity to provide fossil fuels for our military and their direct mission of fighting, not doing the other things that are to try to support this issue, makes no sense. So I ask my colleagues to vote for this common sense amendment. It does not affect the existing contracts, and it's a better use of taxpayer dollars, and it's better for the members of the service to put a hiatus on new contracts while we are under sequestration and all of the things that have been talked about. So I would encourage my colleagues to support the amendment. And with that, I recognize the chairman for any comments he might have.
Gentleman's time has expired.
All right, I yield back.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will point out that those figures are incorrect, as stated by my colleague. In 2015, the DoD Department paid $2.03 for 77,660 gallons of fuel at a 10% blend. I just wanted to correct the record because those are the accurate figures, and I think those figures speak volumes. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
For purposes of gentleman seek recognition.
I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report Number 115-212, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at a time in which we need to balance our budget and prevent a legacy of debt from being left to the next generation, it's really time to ask ourselves, not only should we blast through the budget caps, but can't we afford to at least make a small and important step towards protecting our fiscal security as a nation, which is a critical part of our national security. By spending beyond our means, we make ourselves economically beholden to other nations like China and Saudi Arabia. That makes America less secure rather than more secure. As structured, the NDAA is fiscally irresponsible. We've had a number of discussions about that outside of the context of a full budget discussion. It's hard to talk about exceeding the Budget Control Act by $72.5 billion, an additional $10 billion of base spending. It's a broader discussion about the budget that needs to be had. What my amendment would do very simply, Mr. Chairman, is give authority to the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Energy to reduce the overall amount of money authorized in this bill by 1%. It excludes personnel and health accounts from being included in these reductions. A 1% reduction still leaves us well above the original defense cap spending levels that I actually support. And if I had my way, I'd keep those budget numbers for defense spending. But I think this 1% is a very reasonable compromise for those of us who believe that we need to at least show a symbolic gesture towards fiscal responsibility as we head into the budget negotiations. In this bill, there's many overfunded accounts, accounts that are funded at levels above and beyond what our own military requested. A 1% reduction in that context is extremely reasonable. It's $6.2 billion out of this bill. And I have no doubt that there's many ways to find the excess money in the bill that we would leave up to the military to reach that spending level. We can consider numerous programs. This doesn't have to be across the board. We can consider programs where the bill authorizes procurement levels that exceed the President's request and the military's request. My colleague from Massachusetts pointed this out during the bill's markup when he introduced an amendment to reduce the number of littoral combat ships from 3 to the Navy's own request of 1. We are effectively blocking the Navy from making a fiscally reasonable decision. And there's dozen more helicopters, aircraft, and missiles than the President even requested in this budget. So we're not going to cut every one of those items. Many of them have found their way into the unfunded priority list, which the Pentagon provides to Congress. And in a perfect world, if we had all the money in the world, we could have included all those items. But at some point, we have to make decisions about the direction of our military budget, and we can't allow ourselves to be convinced that somehow we can sustain this level of spending. We can't. Frankly, even with this 1% cut, the level of spending is unsustainable and plunges us further into debt. But I think hopefully that's the least that Democrats and Republicans in Congress can come together around as a simple first step. My amendment is a very small first step, and we don't have to choose between protecting the homeland and fiscal restraint. When Congress is imposing spending that the military itself doesn't even want, here's a vehicle to hand the military the ability to rein in some of that unnecessary spending that reduces our national security rather than improves it. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on my amendment and take this modest step towards fiscal responsibility, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chair of the Subcommittee on Tactical Air and Land Forces, Mr. Turner.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is not about fiscal security. It's arbitrary. It's arbitrary cuts without any reference whatsoever to our security risks, without any assessments to our needs of our military, and it is incorrectly stated that we're giving things to our military that they do not want. In fact, they needed more. There's a whole category called unfunded requirements that they put before the House Armed Services Committee. I want to say again, unfunded requirements. It's not unfunded wishes, unfunded needs, unfunded requirements, and they're based on the mission that we've assigned the military and their inability to do so as a result of that gap, and many of which we were unable to fund in this bill. And what would some of those relate to? We can take a tour around the world and we know the risks that we are facing. China, Russia, North Korea, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, ISIS, terrorism. These are not issues that you take up lightly and then say we can undertake an arbitrary cut. And by the way, this is not, if this was really about fiscal security, it would be a 1% cut across all spending, but it's only going to apply to military. This doesn't apply to the IRS. It doesn't apply to the EPA. This is only saying that the military should be cut as a result of some concept of fiscal savings. But the savings that we've taken have damaged our military already. The Air Force Vice Chief of Staff, General Stephen Wilson, has testified in February of this month, quote, "We have become one of the smallest, oldest equipped, and least ready forces across the full spectrum of operations in our service history," the entire history of the Air Force. In 1991, we went to Desert Storm. Our Air Force was 500,000 people and 134 fighter squadrons. Today, we find ourselves at 317 total force. 317 in our active force with 55 fighter squadrons. The Navy is the same. It's the smallest since World War II. Deployments continue to increase, and training and maintenance periods have been shortened, eliminated, or deferred. The number of Marine Corps infantry battalions has been reduced by 4 since 2010, going from 28 to 24. Admiral William Moore, the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, has also indicated that the Navy aircraft, 60% are unable to operate.
Do you want 30 more seconds?
Thank you. Sure.
Mr. Chairman, I'd yield 30 more seconds to the gentleman.
The gentleman's recognized.
At the end of this amendment incorrectly states that there should be no cuts to military personnel. And it incorrectly states that because the rest of the cuts actually apply to our military personnel. It applies to what we ask them to do and what we give them to do the job. Our military should be honored. It should not be faced with additional cuts. We should honor what's in this bill. We should satisfy their requirements, and we should support our men and women in uniform. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
You know, the gentleman asked why aren't there cuts for other agencies? That's not the bill we have before us. We have the National Defense Authorization Bill before us. I have supported similar cuts in various agencies when we've had those appropriations bills on the floor. This is the biggest bill on the authorization side, and then, of course, the companion appropriations bill. This is over 40% of our discretionary expenditures, and the authorization for 40% of our discretionary expenditures are in this bill. So a 1% cut is very meaningful in this bill. That doesn't mean that 1% cuts in other areas aren't meaningful too. They are. There is no single other area that is as important fiscally as this area, and I think it would set a positive tone for reining in out of control spending. There are many accounts that are funded at levels above President Trump's request. So if the gentleman is saying somehow that this cut would leave anybody unprepared, he's basically saying that President Trump's budget would leave the military unprepared or leave people poorly equipped. The truth is, there's many of us who support vastly lower spending levels and believe that those are sufficient for national defense. That's not even what this amendment does. It simply reduces spending just over $6 billion, $6.2 billion, still blasts through the budget cap. The ranking member has indicated that he supports this bill, and I deeply respect his expertise in military preparedness. I encourage my colleagues to unanimously adopt my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. As we all know, over the past 8 years, the world certainly has become a more dangerous place, and we face a variety of threats that, quite frankly, we're not keeping pace with. And we simply cannot continue a pattern of underfunding our military. Yes, we must keep our financial house in order, but we absolutely cannot afford to allow the quality of our national defense to decline by further defense budget cuts. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. I'm concerned about a growing notion that we can thank service members for their service, but then somehow not provide them everything they need to do their job. That we can continue to allow them to have airplanes that don't fly, ships that can't sail, not having the readiness they need to prepare for the missions we send them on. It's, as gentleman from Ohio said, that hurts people. And unfortunately, that's what's happened in recent years. Mr. Chairman, defense spending this year is still 18% below what it was in 2010. So what's happened is we have cut the defense budget while the threats that we send our military out to keep us safe from have grown. And remember, 2010 was before Russia invaded Crimea, before China started building islands in the South China Sea, before ISIS even existed. This budget that's before us does not fix all our problems. It is a start, and I think it is about as much as we can do in a single year. But even if this bill passes, we are not up to 2010 levels. We have not made up the ground that we have lost. So I believe that the men and women who serve deserve our best. This bill, I believe, comes close to providing our best to them this year, it should be supported, and this amendment should be rejected.
The gentleman yields.
I yield.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado will be postponed. It is now in order to consider the amendment number 5, printed in Part B of House Report 115212. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise as the designee for the gentleman from Wisconsin, and I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Ms. Jayapal of Washington.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the reality is that our economic security is part and parcel of our national security. And so it is in line with these values today that we introduce Amendment 334 to the National Defense Authorization Act, which states a sense of Congress that any appropriated increase to the combined national defense budget and the overseas contingency operations budget are matched dollar for dollar by non-defense discretionary spending increases. For years now, these spending increases have occurred concurrently and equally, keeping important parity between defense and non-defense discretionary spending. Because genuine national security depends on the health, vibrancy, and safety of our communities, we must ensure that this spending parity continues and that this Democratic Party principle carries on into FY18. Non-defense discretionary spending includes a host of funds that are crucial to the American people, from education to research to veterans' health care to transportation and even homeland security. NDD funding is absolutely essential to moving our country forward. Mr. Chairman, as vice-ranking member of the Budget Committee, I echo the comments made earlier by our ranking member, Mr. Smith, about the dysfunction that we have as we have yet to consider an FY 2018 budget resolution, and we have only 23 legislative days before the new fiscal year begins. The effort to push through $696 billion in defense spending will trigger sequestration under the Budget Control Act, and our communities will pay the price in cuts to vital programs. This is senseless brinkmanship, and we must reject it. Sequestration would further hinder job creation and stall economic growth by cutting $2 trillion in discretionary spending for infrastructure that makes our communities thrive: roads, bridges, transit, railroad systems, broadband, ports, airports, waterways, schools, and safe, clean water systems. It will erode our investments in education, worker training, public health, and community development that strengthen the middle class and working families. And these shortfalls, Mr. Chairman, will hurt the American people and our economy and make us less secure as a nation. Budgetary gimmicks don't make our nation safer either, and that's why in the People's Budget, which we introduced in the Progressive Caucus, the Overseas Contingency Operations budget is actually zeroed out, as it is essentially a zero accountability slush fund used to avoid the restrictions imposed by the Budget Control Act. Some have pointed out that $10 billion of the $631.5 billion for the military-based budget needs is actually labeled OCO purely as a technicality to evade the Budget Control Act caps. This is in addition to the clearly marked $65 billion of OCO funds. By including OCO funding one-to-one match in our amendment, we're sending a message that we will not accept these efforts to undermine the best interests of our country and its people. Increasing opaque funding sources comes at the expense of our nation's infrastructure programs, education, and all the other things that I mentioned earlier. So to the extent that Congress provides relief from the post-sequestration funding levels for our military, responsible members of this body should be united in insisting that the same relief would apply to domestic discretionary spending. This amendment underscores the reality that economic security is national security. For these reasons, and to support the continuation of this important principle, we urge support of this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, to oppose the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
I yield myself 2 minutes.
Second.
Mr. Chairman, in some ways, I think this may be one of the most important debates we have in the next 3 days, because the question is whether our support for the men and women who serve in the military is conditional or not. Will we only repair the planes they fly? Will we only fix the ships they sail if and only if exactly an equal amount will be added to domestic spending programs? Will we only provide for military spouses for their needs? Will we only take care of wounded warriors for their increased needs if and only if an exactly same amount, the exact dollar for dollar, is added to domestic programs? That holds the military hostage to a domestic political agenda. And I think that is fundamentally wrong at every level. These men and women go out and risk their lives to keep us safe, and yet they've got to not only worry about North Korea up on the DMZ, they've not only got to worry about ISIS in Syria, they've got to worry about whether we will pass some domestic program if we're going to adequately provide for them. The Constitution says it's Congress's responsibility to provide for the military without condition. This sort of approach, saying we'll only do this for the military if and only if we get what we want on domestic programs, breaks faith with the men and women who serve. It is wrong at every level, and I reserve the balance of the time.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have remaining?
1.5 minutes.
I'd like to yield a minute to the distinguished gentleman from Washington.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is nothing political about a domestic agenda, and this isn't conditional on additional money being spent. In fact, the chairman's got it exactly flip-flopped. The money that we are providing for the armed services at this point, the extra money, is conditioned on cutting it from everything else, as we saw in President Trump's budget. $54 billion plus up for defense, $54 billion taken away from the domestic agenda. And it is beyond insulting to say that if you support any sort of domestic spending, you don't care about the troops. That, being concerned about transportation infrastructure, which, by the way, bridges have collapsed and killed people in this country because of the problems with our transportation infrastructure. The Department of Homeland Security is part of non-defense discretionary spending. Does it not protect us? We've heard from the president it does. The State Department, also part of non-defense discretionary spending, where we've heard from the Secretary of Defense that it saves lives. So for our committee, the Armed Services Committee, say, we're all that matters. To hell with everything else. And if you care at all about transportation or a domestic agenda, you don't care about the troops, that is what is an incredibly disingenuous argument.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman for Texas recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I think all of us care about domestic spending programs. I certainly do. And I am not for the cuts that were proposed by the administration. That's what we are here to do and decide. What I am opposed for is the sense of Congress that every dollar we increase in defense has to be matched by an increased dollar on domestic side. That makes it conditional. That makes it tied to a domestic political agenda on the EPA, the IRS, education, transportation, whatever it is. My point is all of those things need to stand on their own merits, and defense needs to stand on its own merits. Support for our military needs to stand on its own merits. Having planes that fly and ships that sail and adequate funding for our troops and their families stand on their own merits. It cannot be conditional upon whether or not this Congress or this president agrees on other spending items. They need to stand on their own 2 feet too. But it is absolutely wrong to say we will only support these military folks if we get what we want on the domestic side.
Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just have to say that this is conditional because we still don't have a budget resolution. So in the absence of a budget resolution, the reality is we're looking at a budget that could potentially raise $676 billion for defense, but at the expense of all the other programs that we've mentioned. And the reality is that families in the armed services also care about education, about health care, about roads, about everything else that is funded in domestic spending. So we have to to make sure that these two things are interconnected. And yes, we've got to make sure that the State Department is funded and that we continue to push for a budget that keeps parity between defense and non-defense discretionary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield the remaining 2 minutes to a valuable member of our committee, Dr. Jay Gerlet of Tennessee.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman. No one can deny we have a readiness issue within our military due to funding shortfalls. And this comes at a time we're facing unprecedented threats all over the globe. Our Constitution makes it clear that our top priority and duty is to provide for the common defense. In World War II, Americans willingly rationed whatever was necessary to support the war effort and our troops. It would have been unthinkable, unimaginable for someone to suggest that our military could not have the resources necessary to defeat our enemies unless we had equal spending for everything else. Simply put, we would have lost the war and our freedom. We cannot lose sight or take for granted our nation's safety and security. Without it, the rest of the discretionary budget really doesn't matter so much. I fear America has lost its way if we live in a culture that would suggest that we can't support our most vital obligation without equal financial representation of our other government expenditures. I urge my colleagues to give our full support to the men and women in uniform, support the underlying bill, but oppose this amendment that adds unnecessarily to our debt and further threatens our ability to keep the nation safe from the many threats we face. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, can I have a recorded vote?
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 6, printed in Part B of House Report Number 115-212, offered by Mr. Nadler of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and a member opposed will control 5 minutes. The chair will recognize the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, my amendment will strike Section 1022 of the bill that prohibits the transfer or release of prisoners from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to the United States. We are currently imprisoning 41 people at Guantanamo, 26 of whom are being detained indefinitely without charge or trial, with no proceedings, no hearings, no opportunity to plead their case, essentially forever. Beyond existing as an affront to fundamental American values, Guantanamo is a dangerous, counterproductive relic of the past. National security experts and our own military commanders agree that Guantanamo harms our national security by serving as a recruiting tool for terrorists and damaging our relationships with allies. Furthermore, it is increasingly difficult to justify the annual cost of holding each Guantanamo detainee, which has now climbed to an incredible $10 million a year per detainee. Guantanamo is now the most expensive prison on earth, costing U.S. taxpayers approximately $445 million per year. This is especially disappointing when you consider that each prisoner in a federal maximum security penitentiary costs only $78,000 a year. Not only does our refusal to close Guantanamo diminish our legal and ethical reputation throughout the world, it also costs American citizens astronomical sums of money for no purpose. We have made excellent progress towards reducing the numbers of prisoners, and we should continue to do so. About 35% of released prisoners were confirmed or suspected of returning to the battlefield during the Bush administration. But the Obama administration developed a robust framework to ensure released detainees were more closely supervised to reduce the likelihood of a return to the battlefield. The Bush administration struck diplomatic deals to repatriate large batches of prisoners to countries like Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan in bulk, and many recidivists came from those batches. By contrast, the Obama administration developed an individualized review process by 6 agencies to determine whether to recommend transferring a detainee. Over time, it also developed more careful diplomatic and monitoring plans with receiving countries to ease a prisoner's reintegration into that country's society. When the first detainees arrived at Guantanamo in January 2002, America was still reeling from the 9/11 attacks, and the war in Afghanistan had only just begun. Yet 15 years later, it is clear that the war on terror has dragged on for too long, as we have expanded our involvement in costly clashes in Yemen, Somalia, and Syria. In doing so, we have embroiled ourselves in needless, endless conflict without an exit strategy or a clear strategy for success. The recent vote for Congresswoman Barbara Lee's amendment to repeal the 2001 authorization for the use of military force in the House Appropriations Committee demonstrated that Congress is finally realizing a blank check for perpetual war must be reevaluated and reconsidered. Similarly, as we reconsider the 2001 AUMF, I look forward to working together in a bipartisan manner to close the Guantanamo prison, reevaluate our approach to these detainees, and close another dark and sad chapter that has damaged our national honor. Guantanamo's continued operation provides a momentous challenge to the founding principles of the United States, that no person may be deprived of liberty without due process of law, and certainly may not be deprived of liberty indefinitely without due process of law. And for each day that its doors remain open, it becomes increasingly difficult for our nation to claim the moral and ethical high ground. We must close the detention facility at Guantanamo now, and this amendment will help us achieve that goal. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For purposes, the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I claim time in opposition to the Nadler Amendment. The Nadler Amendment would allow detainees currently housed at Gitmo to be transferred to the United States. As in previous conflicts, it's appropriate and lawful to hold detainees that we engage in our armed conflicts. Guantanamo is the safest and most appropriate location to house these detainees. Members can visit there. It's secure and relatively distant from the United States. Moving to the U.S. puts our homeland and citizens at risk. Our enemies have, when able, attacked and on occasion freed detainees, even committing suicide to do it. I've seen the attempts. I served in Iraq at a detention facility. And as far as Guantanamo being a recruitment tool, it might just be a recruitment tool. And here's why. Because if you're caught trying to kill Americans and committing acts of terrorism, you get to go to a Caribbean island that provides humane conditions for the detainees. Go visit there, you'll see that. They have appropriate access to health care, the same health care that our troops get. They have recreational activities, they have cultural and religious materials. But more important than anything else, our troops and the detainees that they hold there are all safer in Cuba. It's very difficult to sneak up and attack Guantanamo Bay. The recent terrorist attacks in Europe should remind us all that there is significant risk, that we face significant risk in this world. Yes, we wish the war on terror was over, but guess what? It's not. And this would only increase the risk right here in our own backyards. Congress has passed and the President has signed into law restrictions on Guantanamo detainee transfers to the U.S. every year since fiscal year 2010. To house these terrorists, these enemies of freedom on our own land is dangerous. And I ask for your support in defeating this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves.
How much time do I have?
Quarter minutes.
I'll yield myself 15 seconds, and I'll simply observe that this amendment prohibits the President from transferring prisoners. Do you really think that Donald Trump, the current president, needs that prohibition, that he would transfer prisoners to maximum security prisons in the United States if it weren't safe to do so? I yield back. I reserve, rather.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman.
I would like to yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to this amendment. I can attest unequivocally, based on firsthand knowledge, that this latest attempt to transfer detainees at Guantanamo Bay is strategically unwise and I believe morally wrong. None of the arguments in favor of transferring these prisoners are defensible militarily, legally, or financially. We are in a war and these prisoners were captured on the battlefield. There is no hard evidence to support the argument that Guantanamo is a decisive recruiting tool, and it is extremely naive to believe that closing it would somehow magically change the hearts and minds of our enemies. We could disarm and renounce every interest we have, and they would just invent another reason to attack us. The truth is that many of these prisoners are the worst of the worst. Yet they are treated better than many of our own veterans. And here's the key point. Prisoners related from Guantanamo have killed Americans in the past and if given the chance will gladly do so again, a fact openly conceded by officials in the Obama administration itself. We do not want the blood of Americans killed by these terrorists in custody today on our hands. And I yield back.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It costs the American taxpayer $10 million a year per detainee to keep a detainee in Guantanamo. To keep that same detainee in a federal maximum security penitentiary in the United States would cost $78,000. That's a ridiculous waste of our military budget. Nobody has ever escaped from a federal maximum security prison. Transferring these prisoners to federal maximum security prisons in the United States would pose no danger to anybody. And yes, some of these prisoners may be the worst of the worst. Many are not. They were not all caught on the battlefield. Some of them were sold for bounties by people in different tribes or groups in Afghanistan. Some of them were not captured on battlefields at all. Some of them are innocent. Some are not. But to keep them in Guantanamo for $10 million each per year with no possibility of getting out is an affront to our values, it's an affront to our liberties, it's an affront to our military budget and to our pocketbooks, and it's frankly plain foolish. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from the House recognized.
And I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague, the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik.
Gentleman, lady is recognized.
I rise in opposition to Mr. Nadler's amendment, which strikes language that prohibits the use of funds to transfer or release Guantanamo Bay detainees to the United States. As we are all aware here today, Gitmo holds some of the world's most dangerous and heinous terrorists, individuals who are responsible for and are ideologically committed to killing Americans at home and abroad. They are responsible for killing our men and women in uniform. Transferring these terrorists to the United States, where constitutional protections and immigration law may apply, puts our national security at risk and hinders our intelligence gathering abilities. Today, we remain in a war against al-Qaeda and all associated forces. It is the responsibility of Congress to do everything in our power to provide the resources and authorities to win that war, and transferring Guantanamo Bay detainees to the United States undermines these efforts. Therefore, I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman from the House recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from the House, the only time remaining.
How much time does remain?
1 minute.
1 minute. I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman's yielding. I oppose the gentleman's amendment. We've debated this issue for years now, and every year we successfully maintain the prohibition on transferring dangerous detainees out of Gitmo. It is important to remember that most of the 41 remaining prisoners are very dangerous. The language in the underlying bill is required to keep the American people and our allies safe. One of the main goals of Guantanamo Bay is to keep these terrorists from returning to the battlefield. Sadly, it has become clear that some of the detainees released have returned to the field to fight the United States. We ask our service members to put their lives on the line each and every day in order to keep the American people safe. How can we ask them to do that while knowing that we are releasing cruel, brutal terrorists back to the battlefield? It would be reprehensible. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment and protect our service members and the American people, and I yield back.
Gentleman from the House recognized.
I yield back the remaining balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from New York.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a second amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 7, printed in Part B of House Report Number 115-212, offered by Mr. Nadler of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I will not take 5 minutes. This amendment will strike Section 1023 of the bill that prohibits the use of funds to construct or modify facilities in the United States for Guantanamo detainees. The provision is simply designed to further delay the transfer of detainees out of Guantanamo and is unnecessary and counterproductive. The arguments for this amendment and against it are essentially the arguments for and against the previous amendment that we just went through. That amendment prohibited the use of funds to transfer prisoners. This amendment prohibits the use of funds, or this provision, rather, prohibits the use of funds to construct facilities in the United States to receive such transferees. It's essentially the same pros and cons. I just want to mention, though, that yes, some of those detainees may be the worst of the worst, but they will still be detained. But some of them are not. They are people who were caught up in bounty situations where they were sold for money. They were, because we were giving a bounty to, if someone claimed that the so-and-so was a combat, had been in combat against us, but we didn't really know. We now know mistakes were made. We may choose to say some of these people can go home, and others can stay in the United States. It's simply, again, a question that we shouldn't be spending $10 million a person instead of $78,000 a person to hold them in secure facilities. The other thing that Ms. Stefanik of New York said, I must comment on, she said, we're holding people in Guantanamo because if we transferred them to the United States, they would enjoy the constitutional rights of prisoners in the United States, and that we don't want to do for whatever reason, she didn't say. But the fact of the matter is, Guantanamo was built for that purpose, because it was thought by the Bush administration initially that people held outside of the continental United States, in Guantanamo, which is in Cuba, not the United States, would not enjoy constitutional rights, could not use the writ of habeas corpus and other things. However, a series of Supreme Court decisions said that was wrong. The prisoners held in Guantanamo Bay have the same constitutional rights as prisoners held in prisons in the continental United States. So there's no difference on that whatsoever. And what it comes down to is, you can look up the Supreme Court decisions, they're not secret, and what it comes down to is a prejudice against holding people here because of a ridiculous fear that people will escape from maximum security prisons, which no one has ever done in the United States, and we can't hold dangerous terrorists here, and we shouldn't release terrorists, but nobody's talking about releasing terrorists. And you can hold dangerous terrorists and dangerous mobsters, dangerous all kinds of people in maximum security facilities in the United States. And there are really two things we should do. Bring them to maximum security facilities in the United States because it saves a lot of money and because it removes a major recruiting tool for our enemies abroad. And within constitutional rights, people should have the opportunity to have a hearing. What's most offensive is not that they're at Guantanamo as opposed to some prison in the United States. What's most offensive is that we are holding some people without any hearing, without any due process, essentially forever. And yes, we have held people as prisoners of war during the pendency of a war, but we don't claim these people are prisoners of war. We don't give them the rights of prisoners of war. We're just holding them. I'm not sure how we're holding them, but we're holding them with no claim of any kind of due process, with no finding that they have in fact been a terrorist in an individual case, and that's just against all American values, and I move the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields?
Or I reserve, I should say.
Gentleman reserves. For what purposes the gentlelady from Missouri seek recognition?
I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong opposition to this irresponsible amendment that allows the construction of facilities in the U.S. to house detainees. And I urge my colleagues to vote no. We are still at war with terrorism, and the law of war affirms that detainees can properly be held off the battlefield for the duration of the hostilities. Both Republican and Democrats have repeatedly rejected bringing terrorists detained at Guantanamo Bay to the United States. It would be a negligent act to transfer highly dangerous terrorists, such as the mastermind of 9/11, to U.S. soil to be housed near our neighborhoods and near our families. The gentleman said that these, they're not the worst, that some people are just, caught up perhaps, and they're there. That is not true. I have been there multiple times. At this point, we only have 41 left, and they are the worst of the worst. There is no one left who you might even claim was just caught up and accidentally arrested. That is false. Like I said, I have visited multiple times to see firsthand the threats facing our country and the detention procedures carried out at that facility. It does not make sense to build a new facility to spend our precious defense dollars here to house terrorists when we already have adequate, very safe facilities at Guantanamo where they're being treated humane, it's legal, transparent. It's a remote location, it's away from the battlefield and away from our loved ones. And so I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The General reserves.
All right.
Gentleman from New York reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Ms. Hartzler. You'll hear, and you've already heard, in favor of the Nadler Amendment, such as Gitmo is contrary to American values. Detainees can be held safely at no less cost in the U.S. prisons, and Gitmo is a recruiting tool for terrorists. Points against the Nadler Amendment: the #1 task of the federal government is to provide for the common defense and security of the United States of America and American citizens. Americans are safer with detainees in Guantanamo versus the homeland. Gitmo is the safest and most appropriate location to hold detainees. It is appropriate and lawful to hold detainees until all al-Qaeda and associate forces are defeated. The law for war detainees, including Gitmo detainees, states that they cannot be commingled with federal prisoners, thus requiring separate facilities costing hundreds of millions of dollars. Evidence of the use of Guantanamo as a recruiting or propaganda tool is conjecture, subjective, and inconclusive. Terrorists will continue to attack whether Gitmo exists or not. Terrorists will invent any excuse to attract new recruits, and I yield back and will not support this. Thank you.
General reserves.
Thank you. I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. I rise in opposition to this amendment. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to travel with Chairwoman Hartzler to Guantanamo Bay and see firsthand the important work our military men and women stationed there are doing for our national security. As representatives of the people, we have been given the duty by the American people to provide for a common defense, and that includes appropriately detaining suspected terrorists. According to the March 2017 Director of National Intelligence report, it estimated 29% of former Gitmo detainees are confirmed, 17% of those are suspected, 12% of re-engaging in terrorist or insurgent activities. The ones we hold now are the 41 worst of the worst, including KSM, and we cannot allow them back onto the battlefields. These people do not need to be housed on U.S. soil. Gitmo is the most appropriate and safest place to hold these detainees. They live better than I lived both of my tours in Iraq in 2005 and 2009 and 10. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
From New York. Reserves, gentleman is recognized.
Sure. I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Congresswoman Hartzler, for your leadership, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this misguided amendment. I have visited Guantanamo Bay twice, and I know firsthand the detainees at Guantanamo Bay are the worst of the worst. Terrorists who are conspirators of Osama bin Laden, trained mass murderers, and extremists who have a sole intention of killing Americans. We've also seen that releasing terrorists from Guantanamo puts American families at risk. In a report last year, the director of the National Intelligence from the prior administration was clear that at least 116 detainees, nearly 1/3, released from Guantanamo have returned to the battlefield to kill American families. As we have seen from the proliferation of terrorists around the world, from Algeria and North Africa through the Middle East, across to South Asia and the Philippines, the deterrence of incarceration at Guantanamo Bay has never been more important. I urge all of my colleagues to reject this amendment.
Is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no additional speakers. I'm prepared to close if the gentleman from New York is prepared.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
How much time do I have?
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, no one is proposing to release these people, although some probably should be released, but no one is proposing that. So take that red herring off the table. Second of all, I too have visited Guantanamo, and I don't know how you tell by visiting Guantanamo that these prisoners are the worst of the worst or not, just by looking at them. Thirdly, as again, they have the same constitutional rights there as here, so you're not changing anything. And bringing them to maximum security facilities in the United States, while it may cost some money if you had to increase the facilities first, instead of spending $445 million or $10 million a detainee, you'd be spending $78,000 a detainee, which would free up your military budget, part of it, for other things. There is simply no rational reason for keeping these people in a military base in Guantanamo, which simply serves as a recruiting tool and a measuring rod for our enemies abroad. So again, I urge the adoption of this amendment. I yield back.
Generally is recognized.
How much time do I have, sir?
1 minute.
All right. Well, I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. It is not a wise use of our tax dollars to build new facilities here, like the gentleman wants to do, to detain terrorists when we already have adequate facilities that are doing a great job right now at Guantanamo Bay. We need to keep our terrorists there, away from our families, away from our communities, and I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment and to vote no.
Gentlelady yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 8, printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition? The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 8, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Blumenauer of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, and the member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you. My amendment deletes language in this bill that would mandate a program of record green lighting this proposal for road mobile ground launch cruise missiles with ranges that, if tested or deployed, would violate the United States obligations under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. For more than 4 decades, the United States and Russia have worked through bilateral agreements to reduce their nuclear weapons stockpiles, saving money and making the world safer. Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush were at the forefront of this effort with the START I and START II treaties. There's a long-standing precedent of carefully negotiating these treaties in a bipartisan fashion because these leaders knew that a world with less of these weapons meant a safer world for all of us. Yet over the last several years, our nuclear weapons proliferation has continued on autopilot. Right now, we're on track to spend $1.2 trillion on unneeded nuclear weapons. In fact, the Pentagon has concluded that already United States security needs could be met with 1/3 fewer strategic warheads deployed than New START limits of 1,550. We can and should safely right-size the arsenal as envisioned by Ronald Reagan and the first President Bush. That's why these treaties are so important. They hold us and our adversaries accountable. We see some confusing signals from the administration, at times appearing to favor nuclear escalation, while at the same time being deeply concerned about managing costs. Trump has demonstrated a lack of clear understanding of these treaties, but even his administration is fearful that the language undermining the treaty in this bill, quote, unhelpfully ties them to a specific missile system. Congress should be playing a lead role in getting us back on track with smarter defense spending, not working to abandon this nuclear non-proliferation legacy that Ronald Reagan and Bush Sr. fought so hard for. We can't simply fund every weapons program on the list. while fulfilling other critical obligations like providing for our military personnel, ensuring we have adequate cybersecurity protections, strengthening our command and control infrastructure, not to mention our non-Defense Department programs like foreign assistance and diplomacy. We have a poor track record when it comes to carefully managing and budgeting the implementation of our weapons programs. The House continues this poor record now. Why would we establish a program of record for something that our military, our diplomats, and our NATO allies haven't asked for? Rather than rushing to adopt this program and abandoning a key international treaty in the process, let's think this through. Let's do our homework to make sure our allies, the Department of Defense, and State are all on the same page and develop a coherent approach to bring Russia back into compliance rather than throw money at yet another unnecessary weapons program and undercut that regime. This takes our eye off the ball and could have unintended and, I think, in some instances, devastating consequences. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote in support of this amendment for a smarter defense spending and the protection of a landmark treaty that is part of the legacy of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition? I'm sorry.
All those Southerners sound alike. I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized. My apologies.
That's okay. I want to thank the gentleman, Mr. Blumenauer, for his amendment, although I urge its defeat, and start off with pointing out that both the Obama administration as well as the Trump administration have cited the fact that Russia is in violation of the INF Treaty, and neither of those administrations have indicated any belief that Russia will come back into compliance. But having said that, I want to say I'm troubled by that the gentleman would want to provide a veto on the development of a system that hasn't been developed, much less deployed. The gentleman's worried about deployment of a system that we still don't have developed yet. And hopefully it won't be deployed when it is completed. That's really the function of whether Russia comes back into compliance. General Silva, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified before the House in March, quote, "They do not intend to return to compliance absent some pressure from the international community and the United States as a co-signer of that same agreement. There is no trajectory in what they are doing that would indicate otherwise," close quote. The development of this system that we're talking about here today is that very pressure that General Silva was referencing. This kind of development by the Russians This kind of development got the Russians to the table on the INF Treaty anyway. But they're violating the treaty. And that doesn't just matter to Europe, it matters to Asia, which is completely ignored by the gentleman's amendment. And Asia matters on INF. Why? Because 95% of China's missiles are in INF range. The commander of PACOM has testified that he has requirements for intermediate range missiles capability in Asia. Quote, "The aspects of the INF Treaty that limit our ability to counter Chinese and other countries' land-based missiles, I think, is problematic," close quote. We didn't conjure the idea of a ground-launched cruise missile out of the thin air. The U.S. Army reported that introducing intermediate range ground-launched missiles into the land domain provides military value across the range of the joint military operations and provides a land-based counter to our adversaries' anti-excess area denial capabilities. This report was required by the House last year as a part of our multi-year oversight on how to respond to Russia's violations of the INF Treaty, which the prior administration did nothing to challenge. I appreciate the gentleman's interest. I will gladly work with him on ways to counter Russia's violations of the treaty, but I must urge defeat of this well-intentioned but poorly conceived amendment. I urge support of the bipartisan approach taken by the House Armed Services Committee in sections 1244 and 1245, and I urge a vote no on the Blumenauer amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
May I inquire as to the amount of time I have remaining?
1 minute remaining.
Thank you. Well, the question is how to get Russia into compliance. Walking away from our obligations? I think not. The amendment allows going ahead if the Department of Defense certifies to Congress that it's completed a new nuclear posture review to make sure this program fits in the overall strategy, that it certifies that it prefers this program to ensure that NATO's overall deterrence and defense posture remains credible, that the Department of Defense certified it prefers this missile for maintaining strategic stability, that state certifies the program of record is necessary to help verifiably return Russia to compliance, that at least one NATO member state has proven it's serious about hosting the missile, and state certifies that the full Atlantic Council has endorsed deployment of this missile. Those are the conditions in the amendment, and I would think they are reasonable conditions that the gentleman should not object to. If he truly believes in the merit of his argument, there's no reason that that cannot be complied with, and if not, it should not proceed.
From Alabama is recognized.
Again, I want to remind the gentleman that nobody has indicated that Russia has any intention. They've seen no signs that Russia has any intention of coming back into compliance. And I think this is poorly thought out. We need to go forward and not be giving vetoes to other people about what weapon systems we can start developing. And with that, I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I would respectfully request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 9, printed in Part B of the House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek the right to speak on the amendment.
Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
Amendment is at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 9, printed in Part B of House Report Number 115-212, offered by Mr. Wilson of South Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to speak on the amendment to restrict the funding from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization while still providing funds for the international monitoring system. The purpose is simple. Congress never ratified the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It is irresponsible to the taxpayer and contradictory for the United States to financially support an organization that the United States has never officially joined or contribute funds for a treaty that was never enacted. The amendment clearly continues to fund the international monitoring system to improve our global nuclear detection capability and returns us to the long-standing responsible policies from President George W. Bush's administration. This amendment makes it clear protecting American families is the job of Congress, not an unaccountable international body. As we see a rise in threats around the world, our nuclear deterrence capability is crucial to promote our ability to preserve peace. It is also important that the United States does not require adherence to this treaty in order to continue our self-imposed moratorium on testing nuclear weapons of any size or of any kind. However, as we live in a world of increasing threats, we should not bind the United States to an agreement that other nuclear powers like China and Russia do not adhere to. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty has never been enacted, so there is no change in policy or outcome by supporting this amendment, just a saving of taxpayers' dollars. Therefore, I urge passage of this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself as much time as I may consume. As the only physicist in the U.S. Congress, I feel a special responsibility to speak out on the importance of strengthening our global nuclear security architecture. At a time when it's more important than ever for the security of the United States to reinforce international norms against nuclear testing, we are here debating an amendment that would restrict the ability of a key international institution to monitor nuclear weapons, and in fact is designed to undercut prospects for either eventual ratification or even continued adherence to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization Preparatory Commission is tasked with establishing a verification regime to monitor compliance with the Comprehensive Ban on Nuclear Explosive Testing. If enacted, this amendment would send the wrong signal to the world, deliberately risking an opening for the resumption of unrestricted nuclear testing by many nations on Earth, which would be a national security disaster for the United States. During the debate on the Iran nuclear agreement, I received more than a dozen classified briefings, many of them individual classified briefings by our weapons experts who supported the negotiating team. And at that time, I spent a lot of time putting myself in the place of a terrorist or a proliferating nation. And I came to understand the overwhelming technical advantage that the United States possesses today over both other nuclear states and any potential proliferation state, because we conducted more than 1,000 nuclear tests from 1945 to 1992, more than all other countries on Earth combined. Many of those tests were extensively instrumented and have provided us with the ability to accurately computer model and evaluate the performance of nuclear weapons without the risk to safety and to the environment. And this is why no official of the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, or any other of our nuclear laboratories have ever called for a resumption of nuclear testing or an unsigning or deprecation of the CTBT. Because the moment that other nations begin or resume testing, we lose that crucial advantage. It seems very odd to me that my Republican colleagues would want other nuclear or non-nuclear states to obtain intellectual property and parity in this matter. Although under this amendment, the direct funding for the international monitoring system would nominally remain unscathed, it is difficult to imagine that a significant reduction in U.S. technical and financial support to the CTBTO would not adversely affect the organization's ability to maintain and operate any nuclear monitoring system. The proposed amendment also seeks to undermine the U.S. obligation as a signatory not to conduct nuclear test explosions. If the United States unilaterally declares itself exempt, then other countries are very likely to do the same. In addition, contrary to what the amendment implies, UN Security Council Resolution 2310 does not impose any new obligations on the United States. Nothing is mandatory in the UN resolution. But repudiating support for the resolution could trigger bad faith in other nations around the world and reduce U.S. legitimacy and leverage that ensures other countries do not test nuclear weapons. So we should not signal any intention that the United States encourages a return to a more hostile nuclear environment. An environment in which the United States does not condemn nuclear weapons testing, but rather gives away our position as a country that seeks peace and prosperity for our future. We have an opportunity to turn political rhetoric into concrete action to curb the global proliferation of nuclear weapons and secure the safety of future generations. And from a national security point of view, we must acknowledge that the CTBT locks in an enormous competitive advantage for the United States, one that it would be a huge mistake to begin throwing away. And although the CTBT failed to be ratified by a handful of votes the first time it came up in 1999, as George Shultz, the Secretary of State under President Reagan, said, you could say that a senator might have been right to vote against the CTBT when it was first put forward in 1999 and right to vote for it now. Why? Because things have changed. And what he meant by that is that stockpile stewardship works and that the detection system, both that is maintained by the United States and by the world communities, by the CTBTO, works as well. And so short of ratification, the U.S. support for the Preparatory Commission remains essential. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the Wilson Amendment. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman of South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman and friend from Alabama, Chairman Mike Rogers.
The chairman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for offering this important amendment. This is a simple and straightforward amendment that would help us set priorities in spending taxpayer dollars in a small but meaningful way. The U.S. signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty back in 1996, but the Senate voted against that ratification in 1999. We're talking about 2 decades ago. In the meantime, the U.S. has abided by a unilateral pledge to refrain from nuclear explosive tests of any size or kind. But other nations, including Russia and China, have not. They continue to conduct very low-yield nuclear tests that the U.S. does not. Why? 2 reasons. One, the CTBT has not entered into force, and the CTBT doesn't even define what it bans. So while we keep a very stringent policy against testing, other nuclear powers do not. 20 years later, it's time to ask ourselves why we continue to fund the organization for a treaty that's not going anywhere. This amendment wisely funds the international monitoring system, which provides us some benefits, but prohibits the approximately $2 million in payments to the CTBT organization itself that is included in the FY18 budget request for the State Department. Let's set this small common sense priority, and let's reinforce the Obama administration's own position that the UN resolution from last year is not legally binding on the United States. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman from South Carolina.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, to me, this is, again, clearly an amendment which is in coordination with the Senate initiative by Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas that clearly continues the funding of the international monitoring system to improve our global nuclear detection capability and returns us to the long-standing policies from President George W. Bush's administration. The amendment is clear. It protects American families, and it provides that the job is of Congress, not an unaccountable international body. As we see a rise, as I've stated in the past, about threats around the world, our nuclear deterrence capability is crucial to promote our ability to preserve peace. I urge the approval of the amendment, and I yield.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 10, printed in Part B of the House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 10, printed in Part B of House Report Number 115-212, offered by Mr. Aguilar of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For decades, our nation's nuclear weapons and triad have provided us with strategic deterrence against nuclear war and the existential threat it represents. And as is often said, it is essential that these weapons and delivery systems be safe, secure, and reliable. However, the age of our forces is a major concern. Currently, our nuclear-capable bomber fleet contains 76 B-52s, with the first models entering service over 50 years ago and continuing to fly only after numerous modernization efforts. Our Ohio-class submarines' lifespan, which were originally 30 years, have been extended to 42 years, with the end of the 42-year lifespan approaching in 2027. And the first Minutemen III ICBMs were deployed 40 years ago. With the provocative actions of North Korea and the increase in nuclear weapon activities taking place around the world, a credible nuclear deterrent is vital to the national security of the United States. But over the past few years, there has been a good amount of debate as to how much this modernization process will cost. Over the next 30 years, not only will all 3 legs of our nuclear triad, our bombers, ICBMs, and missile submarines, have to be replaced, a sustainment and modernization program for our nuclear bombs and warheads will be taking place at the same time as well. The Congressional Budget Office currently produces a projected cost of nuclear weapons report annually. However, it only covers 10 fiscal years into the future. My concern is that the CBO's current 10-year timeframe does not encompass the later out-year costs, including the late 20s and early 30s, when the costs are projected by many to increase significantly. My amendment would modify Section 1643 of FY15 NDAA, the CBO review of cost estimates of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons delivery systems, to make the time frame 30 years instead of 10 years, Mr. Chairman. I brought this issue up last year when I served on the House Armed Services Committee, and earlier this year, Ranking Member Smith and Ranking Member Visklosky wrote a letter to the CBO expressing their interest in an assessment of the sustainment and modernization costs associated with the triad for the next 30 years. The New York Times reports that the CBO 30-year estimate, which is due to be released later this year, will put costs at more than $1.2 trillion. With a resurgent Russia, a rising China, and destabilized Middle East, there is little evidence that the demands of our conventional forces will decrease. That is why it's imperative that we have proper accounting for our 30-year nuclear modernization process if we are to adequately plan for future conventional and nuclear investments and provide proper oversight. Now, some of my colleagues will say that a 30-year cost estimate isn't worth the paper that it's written on, that they would depict a time period far too much into the future to obtain a realistic estimate. But that isn't the case. Why do we have a FY17 annual long-range plan for the construction of naval vessels, which not only contains an estimated 30-year funding requirement spanning the 30-year time frame, but also this was produced by DoD for a cost of $395,000 to produce? We have a 30-year cost estimate for the Navy, but not for our strategic deterrence. I'll close by mentioning one of our nuclear gravity bombs as an example of why we need a permanent 30-year estimate. According to GAO, one cost estimate produced by NNSA's Office of Cost Estimating points out that it could cost $2.6 billion more than previous estimates to complete the B-61-12 life extension program. But the original baseline was from NNSA's fiscal year 2017 stockpile stewardship and management plan. If Congress hopes to provide proper oversight of these modernization efforts, we must have up-to-date estimates that accurately reflect any updates and changes that impact our nuclear bombs, warheads, and delivery systems. That's why I wish to make the time period for CBO's estimate 30 years instead of 10 years. These are important investments to make in our national security and a responsible way to better understand the costs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank the gentleman. I yield myself such time as I may consume. My friend from California is correct about one thing. I will say a 30-year cost estimate is not worth the paper it's written on. I oppose this amendment just as I oppose a similar amendment by my friend from California, number 12. I submitted amendment number 88 that we will consider shortly. My amendment was a hopeful compromise with my colleagues from California who are offering amendments number 10 and 12 on this same issue. Unfortunately, we've not been able to reach a compromise, so we'll put them all before our colleagues here on the floor for consideration. The bottom line is that my colleagues are asking DoD and CBO to create a 25 and 30-year cost estimate for how much our nuclear forces cost. That would triple the current requirement of 10-year cost estimates. Unfortunately, these type of multi-decade cost estimates won't be worth the paper they're written on. As evidence for that, Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense Tom Hopkins, who would be responsible for creating the DoD report, has called a 25-year report on this, quote, burdensome. He explained it to us this way during a hearing, quote, right now we submit a 10-year report that does have programs and cost on it. As you would expect, looking out that far, 25 years, the credibility of the numbers would be very, very suspect. Forecasting DoD cost over a 25-year period with any useful accuracy is extremely difficult given the challenges of predicting developments in the international security environment and ongoing technological advancements, close quote. The Armed Services Committee and this House have considered these types of 30-year cost estimate amendments for the DoD and CBO in the NDAs for the last 5 years. Each time, for 5 years in a row, these amendments have been defeated. That's because these type of amendments would not result in good, effective oversight and transparency. It would result in false and unreliable data entering the public debate. If any of my colleagues are interested in a reasonable, common sense way to try and shed a little more light on these very long-term plans and costs, I encourage them to vote for my amendment, number 88. My amendment allows the Secretary of Defense to provide for information beyond 10 years if he thinks it's accurate and would be useful in understanding the nuclear modernization programs. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this current amendment and yes on my amendment, number 88. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves.
I'll close, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman close.
Mr. Chairman, if anything, my former chairman, when I was on armed services, it's consistent. He's right. He's continued to oppose this amendment in the past. But what I ask is, why not have a 30-year estimate? We have one for the Navy. We have one for other programs. If these reports truly aren't worth the paper that they're written on, then why commission this report at almost $400,000 in taxpayer costs? The taxpayers deserve, and we deserve, to provide oversight over these costs. If Congress hopes to provide the oversight for modernizing these efforts, we need these up-to-date reports that accurately reflect these updates and changes to bombs, warheads, and delivery systems. I hope that the chairman would agree with me there. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the chair. I would say that the Navy provides 30-year cost estimates because Congress made them, and the Navy doesn't want to do it, and they don't think they're reliable. I urge a no vote on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. Order to be considered Amendment Number 11, printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 12, printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does the gentleman wish to offer his amendment?
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 12, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Garamendi of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, and a member opposed to oppose will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Every year, Congress receives a very important and very helpful report regarding our nuclear weapons enterprises. It's sometimes referred to as the 1043 report because it's mandated by Section 1043 of the NDAA fiscal year 12. It requires the Department of Defense, in cooperation with the Department of Energy, to submit a detailed 10-year plan and budget estimate for our nuclear weapons enterprise. That is, the bombs, the weapons themselves, the command and control, the national labs, the infrastructure and delivery systems, et cetera, et cetera. That report is then reviewed by the Government Accountability Office for completeness and accuracy, and finally the Congressional Budget Office then reviews it and submits an independent report. Terrific, all good. We all agree that that's a good thing. I know that the chairman of the subcommittee wanted that to happen, and indeed we do have it. This amendment simply deals with the reality that this is not a 10-year program. This is a program that will go on for at least the next 25, probably the next 30 years, with extraordinary costs that actually occur beyond the 10-year time horizon. Therefore, it's important that the United States, as we get into this long-term effort to recapitalize our entire nuclear arsenal, that we encounter today and take into account today the most expensive years that will occur beyond the 10-year horizon. This amendment that I'm proposing simply requires that the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy consider a 25-year time horizon for the 1043 report. We really do need to know. And in fact, we have some of that information today. The Department of Energy, that is in the National Nuclear Security Administration, does do a 25-year report, and they apparently think it's accurate enough to present to the committees here. We would like the Department of Defense, which provides the equipment, the means for delivering the bombs, that is the submarines, the various ballistic and intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ground-based ballistic missiles, the new bombers, and quite possibly the new long-range strike LSRO. So let's find out. Let's consider that. And the reason we need to consider it is that it is a pile of money, well over $1 trillion that we'll be spending in the next 25 years. And this is not just my words, but if one were to consider the people that deal with this on a regular basis, for example, the Undersecretary of Acquisition and Technology, Mr. Kendall, on April 14, 2015, he said, we have a problem with recapitalizing the strategic deterrent. We do have a huge affordability problem with that basket of systems. So it is a problem that we're going to have to face up to. Well, who is we? We is us. We're going to have to figure out how to pay for all this, and we're going to have to make some tough choices. So this is simply a matter of trying to figure out how we can get detailed information. I know that our esteemed chairman, with whom I have a tremendous regard, has a little different view, and when he picks up his amendment, I will speak to that. In the meantime, I would ask everybody to support this wise amendment so that we actually have good information upon which to make some decisions today that will then be paid for in the next 15 to 25 years. That's what this amendment is. I reserve my remaining time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purposes the gentleman from Alabama rise?
I rise to claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. I reluctantly oppose this amendment from my friend and colleague from California. He is a very serious, thoughtful, and clearly articulate member, but it's for the same reasons that I just outlined with Mr. Aguilar's amendment. I'll keep this brief because we just talked about this, but going down this path for a 25 or 30-year cost estimate for nuclear weapons is a bad idea and result in bad data. The acting Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration, who is still in the Trump administration, doesn't think it's a good idea either. The HASC and the House have considered this 30-year cost estimate for the last 5 years in a row, and each time it's been rejected. This amendment would not result in good, effective oversight and transparency. I urge my colleagues to consider voting for my reasonable common sense amendment when we get to it, amendment number 88. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment and yes on Rogers 88. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to finish off my time available. May I ask how much time I have available?
Minute and a half.
Oh, that's plenty. Well, this is a common sense amendment. I have great esteem for the chairman, but I really don't think we ought to be mushrooms. I don't think we ought to be kept in the dark. We really are in the process here of making decisions today to spend a vast amount of money, not just in the next 10 years, and we do have estimates of what that would cost, but in the out years. Those out years, we know from information that has been delivered to us that it will be a bow wave, to use the military term, of extraordinary dollars, well into the hundreds of billions of dollars that will be spent in the out years beyond the 10 years. We need to know today because that will bite into the money that we have available for all of the other things that we must do for our national defense. With that, I would ask for an aye vote on this common sense amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
I thank the chair. I agree with the gentleman. We don't want to be mushrooms, but we also don't want bad data. So I would urge no vote on this and urge people to support Rogers Amendment number 88, which will allow the Secretary to go beyond 10 years to 25 or 30 if the Secretary believes it would yield valuable data. And with that, I yield the balance of my time and urge a no vote.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, The noes have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by a gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 13, printed in Part B of House Report 115212. For what purpose the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 13, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Blumenauer of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, has a member and a member opposed. Each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
I would yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
It's time to insert fiscal sanity into our nuclear weapons planning. We're set to spend $400 billion over the next decade, $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years to recapitalize our entire nuclear arsenal. This nuclear escalation will build a force far exceeding what the Pentagon and security experts have said is necessary to deter a nuclear threat. A stronger nuclear program is not going to help us deal with the strategic challenges we face today, the fight against the Islamic State, but it will result in having to crowd out Army, Navy, and Air Force conventional priorities. We need to revisit this strategy. We're here in Congress to make hard decisions about how to spend taxpayer dollars. The Pentagon should provide long-term cost reports and to tell us what certain weapons will actually add to our existing capacity. My amendment deals with one particularly outrageous piece of this unsustainable escalation, the long-range standoff weapon, or the LRSO. Now, this weapon is projected to cost $20 to $30 billion. This amendment would lock the RLSO funding in the fiscal year at 2017 levels until the administration submits a nuclear posture review to Congress that includes a detailed assessment of why we need this weapon. It wouldn't prevent it. It would just keep the funding at the current level until they can tell us why we need it. Until the administration carefully examines the utility of the LRSO, why should we rush its development? After all, the father of this device, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, has argued there's scant justification for spending tens of billions of dollars on this weapon. General Mathias has stated numerous times that he's not sold on it. We shouldn't risk making tens of billions of dollars in commitments like this with potential failure to follow through, all while forfeiting other critical priorities. Before we continue this nuclear escalation on autopilot, let's make sure. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama wish to be recognized?
Arising to claim opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself such time as I may
Gentleman is
consent.
recognized.
I thank the chair. I strongly oppose this amendment, but it's not just me. The Armed Services Committee considered nearly the same amendment during markup, and it was soundly defeated. And it's not just the committee that opposes this amendment. It's also our country's senior-most military officers. They have repeatedly described the urgent need for the LRSO and the declining reliability of the outcomes. They have testified before our committee in March on this exact issue. Here's the nation's second highest ranking military officer, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Silva. Quote, "Outcomes were designed and built in the 1970s with a 10-year lifespan. We know today they remain relevant, but we can't continue to maintain them. A decade from now, those weapons will not be able to penetrate Russian air defenses, and therefore there is an urgency for their replacement." And at the same hearing, STRATCOM Commander General Hyten said, quote, "The LRSO is the first missile system developed in unison with a nuclear warhead in mind for many decades. Limiting resources or funding of either component will disrupt the entire concept to capability timeline." Here's President Obama's Assistant Secretary of Defense, Bob Scheer, testifying before my committee last year, quote, "The Obama administration's decision to field a modern ALCOM replacement is essential to maintain the ALCOM's unique contribution to stable and effective deterrence," close quote. And finally, let me briefly address this nonsense argument that LRSO is destabilizing. Here's President Obama's Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, Rose Gottmiller, testifying before the Senate last year, quote, "First, the LRSO is consistent with our arms control commitments and the President Obama's Prague agenda. Second, the LRSO supports strategic stability and does not undermine it. Third, it's important in the eyes of our allies. There is no evidence that the LRSO or our nuclear modernization program is promoting an action-reaction cycle or catalyzing these arms races. The LRSO is valuable in maintaining strategic stability," close quote. I urge a no vote on this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I would yield 90 seconds to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman is recognized for 90 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make two quick points. First, to the point that Mr. Blumenauer made about how we are planning on recapitalizing our entire nuclear arsenal. Now, we've had a robust debate about how much is that going to cost over 10, 25, 30 years. I have some sympathy for the argument that Mr. Rogers made. It's going to be very difficult to estimate how much it's going to cost over 25 or 30 years. But I do know that if we are talking about recapitalizing our entire nuclear arsenal, all of the submarines, all of the ICBMs, a new bomber, it's going to cost a lot. I don't know if it's 1.2 trillion or 2 trillion or whatever it is going to be enormously expensive. And at a time when we face a multiplicity of threats from Russia, from North Korea, where missile defense is critical, I do not believe this is the best investment of our money to get caught up in the Cold War, in the battle against Russia and their nuclear weapons, and making sure that we could counter every possible scenario. It is not an efficient use of money. This amendment is but one piece of it to say, let's take a step back and see if this is the best place to spend the money. Maybe it would be better to spend it on cybersecurity. Maybe it would be better to spend it on missile defense. There's a whole lot of other places, I think, that are better than trapping ourselves in these nuclear scenarios that require us to build an unbelievably expensive nuclear arsenal. And second, I will disagree with Mr. Rogers on one point. The more you build nuclear weapons, the more other sides tend to build nuclear weapons. I cannot agree that this is not going to potentially lead to an escalation. In fact, the reason we're so hell-bent on building the LRSO and all of these others is because of what we're concerned about what Russia and China are doing. That's how it works. It does have that destabilizing effect. I don't think this is the best place for us to spend our defense dollars.
Gentleman's time has expired. From Oregon reserves. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Chair. And I was quoting Rose Gottmiller from the Obama administration saying that it was not going to perpetuate this cycle. But I would like to yield the balance of my time to my friend from Wyoming, an outstanding new member of the Armed Services Committee, Ms. Liz Cheney.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's surprising to sit here and hear arguments that we've been hearing really for the last almost 70 years now. The notion that the reason that our adversaries build nuclear weapons is because we're building nuclear weapons. Or the notion that we all are building nuclear weapons for the same purposes. The North Koreans are building nuclear weapons in order to threaten us. They're building nuclear weapons potentially in order to hold us hostage. They're building nuclear weapons against which we must deter. And the notion that if we advance our capabilities, the notion that if we produce the LRSO, that we're going to be in a position where we're encouraging the other side is just simply flawed understanding. We already have a situation where our adversaries are modernizing their dual-capable cruise missiles. They don't think that these things are destabilizing. We shouldn't argue that they are for us as well. And in addition, the LRSO plays a hugely important deterrent role. It imposes important and real costs on any potential adversary, because it forces them, in addition to modernizing their nuclear arsenal, to modernize their air defense arsenals. It's hugely important that we proceed. It's hugely important that we modernize. I agree, it's a very expensive undertaking, but I would urge my colleagues to defeat this amendment, and to remember that the single most expensive thing we could do would be to fail to defend ourselves. The single most expensive thing we could do would be to encourage an adversary to attack us because they think that they can overtake us or overcome our capabilities. I think it's important that we not go down the path of unilateral disarmament and that we do everything we can to continue to modernize at a very rapid pace, to speed up the pace at which we're modernizing. I'd like to yield back my time with that and urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is from Alabama is recognized.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I am stunned to think that this is somehow the equivalent of unilateral disarmament. The amendment says that the funding level for this new program would remain at the current fiscal year level until the administration submits a nuclear posture review to Congress that indicates a detailed assessment of why we need the weapon. If what the gentleman says is true, and I get mixed signals from the Secretary, then they can easily do that, and they're not cut off. It has nothing to do with unilateral disarmament, and we have more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy these countries many times over. My friend Mr. Smith talks about other priorities, from cybersecurity to what's happening with ISIS, lavishing funds on programs that have not yet been justified and can't meet this test is not worthy. You have other things that you want to help the Department of Defense do, which I think we share. I strongly urge approval of this amendment.
Gentleman yields back.
Yield back.
Okay, the question on the amendment is offered by the gentleman from Oregon. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Sir?
I would request a recorded vote.
Okay. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 14, printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 14, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. McClintock of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our current defense spending is about where it was at the very peak of the Reagan defense buildup after adjusting for inflation. It's about the same as the next 8 most powerful military forces on the planet combined, and 6 of those 8 are already our allies. Now, the President's proposed adding $54 billion to this. That's the equivalent of adding more than the entire military establishment of Great Britain to what we already have. Yet we're told, and I do not doubt, that much of our military force is ill-equipped and unready for combat. Well, if that's the case, it is not a fiscal problem, it is a management problem. We seem to care how much money is being spent, but not how it is being spent. That is a catastrophic failure of congressional oversight. In recent years, the Pentagon has warned that its infrastructure is 22% bigger than necessary. It's asked Congress for another round of base realignment and closure reviews. Just last month, Secretary Mattis urged resumption of BRAC. He believes it will save $2 billion a year, $20 billion over 10 years. That's enough money to buy 120 FA-18 Super Hornets or 300 more AH-64 Apache helicopters or 4 Virginia-class submarines if only Congress would get out of the way and allow unneeded bases to close or consolidate. The Pentagon has the authority to close or consolidate bases on foreign soil, but in the NDAA, Congress blocks its authority to close or consolidate unnecessary bases on our own soil. My amendment removes the NDAA's prohibition on this needed process and allows BRAC to move forward as our President has requested. His statement of administration policy on NDAA is crystal clear. Quote, "While the bill contains many promising reforms, it fails to authorize a base realignment and closure round which would result in substantial recurring savings and allow DoD to align infrastructure with force reduction." End of quote. I've heard three objections. First, we're told the upfront costs of consolidation can be high, but the results are now in. The first 4 BRAC rounds are saving us $7 billion a year. Second, we're told local economies depend on these bases, but experience tells us that communities rapidly recover by freeing these assets for productive commercial use. Third, we're told to wait until we've finished expanding our forces. But the excess capacity estimate already assumes force expansion, and a new round of BRAC will only wring out a small portion of the overcapacity. When we squander billions of defense dollars keeping obsolete military bases open in order to satisfy congressional constituencies, we directly rob our military forces of the resources that we are constantly reminded that they desperately need. There's an old saying that you can't fill a broken bucket by pouring more water in it. At some point, you've got to fix the bucket. That's our responsibility. We need to take it more seriously, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate very much the efforts by Mr. McClintock, but simply put, now is not the time to consider a base realignment and closure. In the past, BRAC has been used without conducting a thorough study, has incurred significant cost, and jeopardized valuable military communities, such as those of the Midlands of South Carolina surrounding Fort Jackson, or the Aiken-Barnwell community that I represent adjacent to Fort Gordon, Georgia. If facilities are shuttered, the existing secure assets will not be reasonably replicated. In testimony before the House Armed Services Committee just last month, Secretary Jim Mattis stated that he also has reservations about the BRAC assessments. It's also important to be clear, BRAC is not a proven cost-saving measure. The last BRAC cost 67% more than planned to carry out, dramatically reducing any projected savings. It would be undermining to our national security and to communities around the nation to close down military installations without a comprehensive study, especially as the military works to grow the force to address emerging threats around the globe. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to yield a minute and a half to the ranking member, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment. This is very frustrating because I disagree very strongly with the remarks from the gentleman from South Carolina. First of all, the past BRACs have saved us an enormous amount of money. There have been 5 rounds. The first 4 saved us pretty much exactly as much money as they said they were going to. The 5th one was more expensive, but the 5th one was done in 2005 at a time when we were building up the size of the military. And it wasn't so much a closure as it was a realignment, but even then, it is now saving us money. So you want to argue against BRAC, we can argue against BRAC, but please let us not argue that it doesn't save us money, because that is just factually ridiculous. It absolutely saves us money. Second, there have been a number of studies by the Air Force and others. The Air Force has estimated that they are 20% over the capacity of their installations, and it would be great if we could have a comprehensive study. I agree with that. What our bill has done every year for the last several years is prohibit them from even thinking about a BRAC. So it's a brilliant argument to say, well, you can't do a BRAC because you haven't done a comprehensive study, and then to put in the bill, you're prohibited from doing a comprehensive study. It's a nice little tautology, but it isn't helping our military. And as we've been discussing throughout the night, we have more needs than we have money for. We cannot afford for parochial interests to get in the way of what is in the best interest of our troops. We need a BRAC. And while this amendment does, by the way, it doesn't even authorize a BRAC. It simply removes the prohibition of a BRAC. And a BRAC cannot happen unless Congress authorizes it. So all this is going to do, if this amendment passes, is allow the military to do precisely what the gentleman from South Carolina just said they ought to do. There is no reason to oppose this amendment, and I urge support.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to this amendment to the fiscal year 18 National Defense Authorization Act offered by my friend and colleague, Mr. McClintock of California, that would strike a bipartisan provision that clarifies that the fiscal year 18 National Defense Authorization Act does not authorize a round of base realignment and closures, otherwise known as BRAC. After nearly 13 hours of debate in the Armed Services Committee, my colleagues and I on the Armed Services Committee came together and overwhelmingly approved language in the final mark that prevented a BRAC for the next fiscal year. We passed that vote by a vote of 60 to 1. Now, many of my colleagues have argued that past BRACs eliminated excess infrastructure in the nation's military or streamlined defense spending, but it's just not the case, Mr. Speaker. And earlier this year, Secretary Mattis testified to the Armed Services Committee on the need to reassess our military's current infrastructure resources and needs before closing or realigning any current resources. The fiscal year 16 National Defense Authorization Act required an updated DoD forces structure plan and infrastructure inventory. To date, the DoD has not submitted the required infrastructure report. Quite simply, we may not have enough capacity and infrastructure to meet our current needs and our needs going forward as we look at the threats coming from Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, the threat of global terrorism, and transnational criminal organizations. Who knows what threat we will face tomorrow? And the Secretary of Defense, I hope, will work with us to reassess our current capacity, and the need to halt realignments and closures, to give him time to do so, is all the more important. Without outdated capacity information, there's simply no reason to close, or with outdated capacity information, there's simply no reason to close or realign an installation just to repurchase or rebuild a new one just a few years down the road. It's fiscally irresponsible in terms of defense spending and meeting our needs moving forward. While I have nothing but respect for my colleague from California and fought many fights to get rid of waste and cut government spending with him, this is just one that I can't support you on. And I hope that my colleagues will join me in voting against Mr. McClintock's broken bucket amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman. To vote against this measure is to vote to rob our military of $20 million of savings over the next 10 years for military bases the Pentagon itself says are unnecessary. It comes down to that. You cannot provide for the common defense if you cannot pay for it, and the ability of our country to do so is being called into grave question. I yield back.
The gentleman from California's time has expired. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes or such time as he may achieve to the gentleman from Utah, Chairman Rob Bishop.
Recognized for 2 minutes.
That was 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
There is 90 seconds left.
All right. Let me say in 90 seconds then, it may sound counterintuitive that BRAC doesn't save us money, but even though it can take money off the defense rolls, the question is, where does this property end up and who pays for it? The bulk of the property ends up in the hands of local government, state government, and if it was public domain to begin with, Department of Interior's got first crack at it. I have also always sarcastically said every time there's a BRAC base closure, I end up with a new national park and national monument. And even though we have never done a study to verify it, I can give you a couple, I can give you a half dozen off the top of my head where that happens. So the question is, does the taxpayer save money? And if you invent a BRAC process that will guarantee that the federal estate will not be enlarged, that you won't simply transfer property from one federal entity to another or from the federal government to state government so the taxpayer saves money, then I will gladly support a BRAC process. But until we can guarantee that, all we're doing is shifting the money around, shifting the entity around. We may help the Department of Defense change their budget, but the taxpayer is still on the hook for all the property and all the efforts that go into it, and that is wrong. And that is the process. When we change the BRAC process to make it more public, to make it so the taxpayer saves, then I'll support it. But that hasn't happened yet. Therefore, I ask you to vote no on the amendment. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Pardon?
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I'd request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. Pursuant to the order of House today, it is now in order to consider amendment number 88, printed in Part B of House Report 115-212. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 88, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Rogers of Alabama.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. As I said a few minutes ago, I submitted this amendment as a hopeful compromise with my colleagues from California who offered amendments number 10 and 12 on this same issue. I'll keep this very brief because we've discussed this thoroughly tonight, but going down a path of a 30-year cost estimate for nuclear weapons is a bad idea and would result in bad data. As we've debated this for the past 5 years now, the Obama administration didn't want to do it, the Trump administration doesn't want to do it, and the HASC and the House have voted against it every year. I urge my colleagues to consider voting for my reasonable common sense amendment, common sense way to get this issue to resolved with amendment number 88. My amendment allows the Secretary of Defense to provide information beyond 10 years if he thinks it would be accurate and useful in the information it yielded. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on my amendment and no on amendments number 10 and 12. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to claim the time in opposition, though I'm not opposed. I just want to say very quickly.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
I still have the concerns that I have expressed about the broader nuclear weapons issue, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is a way to at least give an option to get a greater idea of the costs. So it may not be everything that we would want, but it's certainly not something that we should oppose. So I do not oppose it and would urge support.
The gentleman reserves.
Actually, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama yields back. So the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Request a recorded vote, please.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to H.Res. 431, I offer amendments in block.
The clerk will designate the amendments in block.
Block number 1, consisting of amendments numbered 3, 11, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, and 31, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Thornberry of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Thornberry, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I rise in support of a very important part of this en bloc proposal, which is filled with important parts. Dr. Afridi is a Pakistani doctor who risked his life to help our special forces identify the hiding place of Osama bin Laden, the planner and commander of the slaughter of 3,000 Americans on 9/11. Dr. Afridi, clearly an American hero, has languished in a Pakistani dungeon for the past 6 years and has been sentenced to spend another 2 decades in captivity. Dr. Afridi is a courageous hero. He is not forgotten. His plight is not ignored. Tonight, I am pleading that this language be retained in the final version of this in-block amendment. This man is suffering for us. Making my amendment in order acknowledges Dr. Afridi's sacrifice and demands Pakistan authorities release him immediately. If we turn our backs on such a noble friend as Dr. Afridi, shame on us. And I thank the members who have put this bill together for including this very immoral statement. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Joe, are you ready? Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to speak on Amendment number 66. On July 4th, the communist totalitarian regime in North Korea marked the holiday by testing an intercontinental ballistic missile. This is yet another escalation by a regime that has tested ballistic missiles and has conducted 5 nuclear tests. This amendment expresses a clear sense of Congress. We will not tolerate the escalation by the regime in North Korea, testing ballistic missiles or developing a nuclear weapon threatening American families. The amendment also reaffirms the strong commitment of the United States to our allies in the region, especially South Korea, Japan, and Australia. I am encouraged by the leadership of President Donald Trump for a commitment of peace through strength. It is clear the regime in North Korea will only respond to its strength, and this sense of Congress strongly states our commitment to keeping all options on the table while addressing the threat of North Korea, whether it be military, diplomatic, or economic. Mr. Chairman, I urge support of this amendment with the en bloc package.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the most important duty of this body is to ensure the safety of every American family, from foreign enemies who intend us harm. We must advocate for a foreign policy that projects strength and purpose. The threat profile our nation faces has never been more severe, including from rogue regimes and those who directly and indirectly support the spread of terror. Acting in isolation, each of these threats requires U.S. attention. However, we must also investigate and understand the scope of evil's reach, especially the nexus between Iran and North Korea. Mr. Speaker, my amendment would compel the Pentagon to report the extent of cooperation on nuclear programs, ballistic missile development, chemical and biological weapons development, and conventional weapons programs between Pyongyang and Tehran. Only when we understand the complex dealings between these enemies of peace can we outline a plan to combat them. My amendment will provide better, more comprehensive tools for American defense, and I urge my friends on both sides of the aisle to support it for the sake of our nation's security. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 90 seconds to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of a bipartisan amendment I've offered along with my colleagues from Texas, Chairman Thornberry of the Armed Services Committee and Mr. Conaway, a fellow CPA. It's essential that Democrats and Republicans work together to control government costs, to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, and that we specifically focus these efforts on the Department of Defense. Chairman Thornberry has promoted a reform agenda of which I'm very supportive. During the Armed Services Committee markup of the bill, I proposed changes to the chairman's reform package. My amendment sought to make the use of private sector auditors more efficient and effective by eliminating bureaucratic mandates and an unnecessarily bureaucratic committee. The chairman supported my goals, and suggested that I work with my fellow CPA, Mr. Conaway. In a bipartisan spirit, we agreed to this amendment, which will, 1, help eliminate the incurred cost audit backlog, 2, help reallocate resources to prioritize higher-risk audits with potential savings for government, 3, help ensure a private sector auditing capacity exists, and most importantly, 4, root out waste, fraud, and abuse in defense contracting. I never thought I would come to Washington to work on Department of Defense audits, but Chairman Thornberry's willingness to engage my expertise and the bipartisan manner of the amendment will hopefully result in significant reforms and aid in my ongoing efforts to help save taxpayers' dollars by making government more effective and efficient. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized. 1 minute.
Thank you. I rise, Mr. Chairman, to speak on the National Defense Authorization Act being considered this evening and on my amendment number 22 to require an Army cyber training readiness assessment. It's vital that we adequately fund our military with the necessary training and tools they need to succeed. Our men and women in uniform deserve the greatest amount of resources that we can possibly provide at all times. If agreed to, my amendment requires the Army to review the Combat Training Centers, or CTCs, and the resident cyber capabilities and training to make certain the needs of pre-rotational cyber training are fully met. These CTCs rotations serve as the premier events to evaluate collective training. And the rotations provide feedback to commanders on how well they've trained their units and their leaders and what they need to do to improve readiness. Including cyber training is a common sense step to meet the threats our nation will face. The Army has testified before Congress that this area is falling short and additional resources are desperately needed for cyber training. Our armed forces must be able to operate within highly defended environments, possibly at the leading edge of a joint force, to control the air, sea, space, and cyberspace domains. My amendment will assist us in this endeavor, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment in Block Package 3, Amendment 53, that would require the Secretary of Defense, in coordination with the Director of National Intelligence, to provide Congress a report in any cyber attack attempts by the Russian government and other Russian hackers targeting the Department of Defense within the past 2 years. These Defense Department systems are the foundation of our nation's defense and security, and it is crucial that they are protected. Despite this understanding, our nation is still not fully aware of the magnitude of the problems, and Congress is not appropriately advised of these past breaches. My amendment would require a report from the Secretary of Defense to Congress so that we can begin to properly address the strength of our nation's security. I want to thank Congressman Shea Porter for supporting my amendment and urge all of my colleagues to do the same. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have no further speakers on this en bloc amendment. Reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you. For clarification, I had yielded 3 minutes, Mr. Correa, but you cut it in half, as I'm understanding. So I will yield you. I already yielded it to you, but I'll give you the other 90 seconds now to the gentleman from California.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment, number 88 to 28, H.R. 2810. This amendment would call upon the Department of Defense to update its cyber strategy, requiring the President to draft guidance for offensive cyber capabilities and to authorize international cooperation, including building of our NATO partner allies' cybersecurity. World War III is raging in cyberspace now. It has become one of the most crucial homeland and global security issues. Our presidential election came under a cyber attack, possibly compromising the American electoral system. But the U.S. is not alone. There were press reports of massive cyber attacks of French President Emmanuel Macron's campaign as well. My amendment will increase our offensive cyber capabilities to prevent our adversaries from engaging in cyber espionage like we witnessed during the past election cycle and recent global cyber attacks. Protecting our network is vital to the security of our nation and allies, and my amendment works to that end. I want to thank Congresswoman Rosen for supporting my amendment as well, and urge all my colleagues to do the same. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back. The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back the time and urge adoption of the en bloc amendments.
Unfortunately, I cannot do the same. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized. 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to start off by thanking the chair and ranking member for supporting these two amendments, one in this block, one in the next block. The first amendment will authorize the Hacking for Defense, or H4D program. This is an innovative program developed in Silicon Valley with the help of battlefield-experienced Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, and it finds unique solutions to national security problems. First taught at Stanford, H4D uses lean business startup methods to engage America's best and brightest in solving real security challenges faced by DoD. Rapid, low-cost technological innovation is what makes Silicon Valley revolutionary. But the DoD hasn't historically had the mechanisms in place to harness this American advantage. Hacking for Defense creates ways for talented scientists and engineers to work alongside with veterans, military leaders, and business mentors to innovate solutions that make America safer. For example, a July 7th New York Times article details how an H4D graduate, Capella Space, is helping track North Korean nuclear capabilities, helping to try to make our world safer. I ask unanimous consent to enter this article into the record, along with 6 letters of support from universities and tech communities. Mr. Speaker, at the Second Amendment deals with cybersecurity standards. At the end of 2016, DoD issued important updated cybersecurity standards for defense contractors. Companies must implement these new standards by January 1st, 2018. However, I've heard from a number of small manufacturers in my district that it's very difficult getting the information and expertise necessary to institute these standards. They fear this may mean the end of their companies. America cannot afford to lose these small businesses. So my amendment encourages the Secretary of Defense to establish a cooperative program between the DoD and NIST to educate and assist small and medium-sized manufacturing firms in achieving compliance with the updated cybersecurity standards. This would help improve cybersecurity access across the defense supply chain, while also preserving competition for DoD contracts, and receive broad support from the business and technology communities. Again, I want to thank the Chair and Ranking Member for supporting these two amendments in this block and the next. I ask my colleagues to support these amendments, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's request to be covered by General Lee. The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington is...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance of our time to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this bipartisan amendment to reauthorize the Suicide Prevention and Resilience Program to 2019. This is a critical program that provides members of the National Guard and Reserves, as well as their families, with training in suicide prevention, resilience, and community healing resources. We simply cannot allow this critical suicide prevention program to expire, not for the men and women who are or who have been on the front lines. Our nation's veterans deserve the best care after putting their lives on the line to protect the freedoms we hold dear. My bipartisan amendment reauthorizes and extends this program to improve safety and ensure continuity and peace of mind for the men and women who serve. Just one soldier lost to suicide is too many. We should do everything in our power to help as many service members as we can. National Guardsmen and reservists face unique challenges. They are citizen soldiers who do not live on a base. They often leave their jobs and families on a moment's notice to suit up to protect us. Even a great guardsman or reservist may not know when and how to ask for help. Yet these men and women still need access to support systems and community networks to help identify potential mental health issues. That is why it is critical that we extend this program to protect the well-being of all of our soldiers. I am proud to offer this amendment in honor of those who serve in the New Jersey Guard and Reserve and across the nation, as well as for their families. I want to thank my colleague, Congresswoman McSally, for her leadership on this issue and for her advocacy on behalf of all service members. I also want to thank Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith for their important work on this critical legislation, and I look forward to coming together as Democrats and Republicans to defend our nation and protect all of those who serve. I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
I think I yield the balance of my time and urge adoption of the amendment.
The question is on the amendments en bloc offered by a gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The en bloc amendments are agreed to without objection. Okay. For what purposes, the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to H.Res. 431, I offer a second package of amendments en bloc.
The clerk will designate the amendments en bloc.
On block number 2, consisting of amendments numbered 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, and 49, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Thornberry of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Thornberry, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I have no request for time and simply urge adoption of this package of en bloc amendments and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington.
Thank you. I yield myself at such time as I may consume just to clean up a couple of earlier debates we had on amendments. Just want to make a couple of arguments. On the nuclear weapon issue, I just want to be clear. We support a strong and robust nuclear deterrence. We are not advocating unilateral disarmament by any stretch of the imagination. We are simply asking, in a budget challenge environment that we have, is this the best use of our money to totally rebuild our entire nuclear weapon system? And the amendments were offered weren't even necessarily saying no. They're just saying this is something we ought to study and ought to talk about. And I will, however, disagree with one argument that was made about how somehow it's a myth that over the last 70 years all of our adversaries are building nuclear weapons in response to the nuclear weapons that we have built. I think that is a big misreading of history. We all recall that we were first to the table on this, and thank goodness we were. It enabled us to end World War II. But we are still the only nation on Earth that has actually used nuclear weapons, and when the Soviet Union developed theirs, we had them and they didn't. And I think it's a little ridiculous to assume that no part of their thinking was that, well, if the United States of America, our prime adversary, has nuclear weapons, we better have them too. And then we saw the arms race accelerate, even to the point of the famous debate in 1960, how candidate John Kennedy talked about the missile gap that we had, that turned out to be a total fabrication, wasn't true. We didn't have that gap. Was unfair to what the Eisenhower administration was doing. But the argument from the other side that the notion of an arms race is ridiculous is something that I think is wrong. Arms races do happen, and part of what we need to do in working with our adversaries is to try to contain them in a reasonable fashion. So I do believe that in many cases it becomes a self-perpetuating thing. We build them, they build them, we build them, they build them, and I hope that part of our nuclear strategy isn't just building as many nuclear weapons as is humanly possible, but is actually opening up lines of communication with potential adversaries like China, with adversaries like Russia. Now, I'll grant you that where North Korea is concerned, and as I have said repeatedly, we have to deter them. But we have the power to destroy North Korea, I think, hundreds of times over. We have the nuclear power, the nuclear capacity in terms of our weapon systems to deter them. So I hope as we look at modernizing our nuclear weapon system, we will consider the cost and the effectiveness of doing that. And I know Mr. Rogers has offered his thoughtful amendment to give the Department of Defense some opportunity to do that, but that's all we were trying to say on that. On BRAC, a couple of arguments were made at the end there that were somewhat misleading. One was that Secretary Mattis had said that he wanted to totally relook at the situation, implying that Secretary Mattis didn't think that a BRAC was a good idea. The Pentagon, President Donald Trump's Pentagon and Secretary Mattis's Pentagon, recommended a BRAC round that we rejected. So make no mistake about it, the Republican president and Secretary Mattis support a BRAC round. And not lastly, two more minor points. It was argued that, well, we voted for this bill 60-1 out of committee, so we were all in favor of it. Yes, we were, not all, but we were in favor of the bill. This was a small piece of that bill. So to argue in a bill, and forgive me, I don't know how many pages this year's bill is. I know last year's was 1,600. That in a 1,600-page bill, if you vote for it, you got to support absolutely everything in it, is a notion that I don't think any member would support. And again, I'll emphasize an argument that I made with Mr. Wilson on the notion that, well, gosh, they don't have a study. They haven't looked at it. They haven't thought about what they're going to do, when in fact it is Congress that has prohibited them legislatively, and I don't know how many of the last few years, but several of them, from doing that. Let's at least let them take a look at it to give us the numbers, because same point as the nuclear weapons issue. As we have heard over and over and over today, we have crucial readiness shortfalls. In many ways, I will agree with the chairman. We are right now not doing right by the men and women who serve in the military, by not providing them with the training and the equipment they need to do the missions that we are contemplating having them do. And if that is the case, if we can find savings by not building as many nuclear weapons as we need, or by closing institutions that we do not need, then I think that is something that we owe the men and women who serve in the military. And let's not kid ourselves. This is a very parochial issue. And there's a whole bunch of bases in the state of Washington. I don't want to see any of them closed, but if the military decides that that's the best thing to do, I'm not going to stand in the way of it. And I hope, given the dire situation that we face that has been described by my Republican colleagues, that we would put parochial concerns to the side and do what is best for the military to make sure that we're spending the money as wisely as we possibly can, and to make absolutely certain that the men and women who serve are trained, equipped, and ready to fight whatever fight it is we ask them to go into. And with that, I will yield the balance of our time and urge adoption of the second en bloc amendment.
The gentleman from Washington yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
And Mr. Chairman, I want to take a moment to address the topics that the gentleman from Washington addressed. First off, I completely agree with him. This bill that we are considering today and tomorrow and the next day is about 1,000 pages. I don't agree with it all. It has everything from missile defense to helping spouses pay licenses when they are forced to move from state to state. And I suspect I will not agree with it all at the end of the day. What's important, though, is the overriding obligation we have to support the men and women who risk their lives to protect us. And so I think the gentleman is exactly right. Just because you vote for the bill does not mean you endorse everything in it. And at the same time, even if you disagree with some of the things in it, it's important to support the men and women who serve by voting for the bill, even if you have disagreements. I completely concur with the gentleman on that. When it comes to the nuclear issue, there are a few points I want to make that maybe were not made during the previous debates. Number one is we have drastically fewer nuclear weapons now than we had during the Cold War. I think a lot of people do not realize how significantly fewer weapons and delivery systems we have now than we had all during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. But these are still machines. They do not live forever. Whether you're talking about the weapon itself or the delivery systems, they age. And as they age, there's chemical reactions. Parts wear out. Things change. And so they have to be modernized if our deterrent is to remain credible. Now, you can get into an argument about, okay, how many weapons does it take to be credible, and what delivery systems are required to penetrate defenses, to hold enough targets at risk to have that credible defense. But what I think there can be little debate about is that the world is growing more dangerous in the nuclear field. We've seen what happens with North Korea. There's enormous concern about what happens in the Middle East and elsewhere. And so I believe that our nuclear deterrent is the foundation upon which the rest of our defense efforts are built. And that foundation must remain credible. It has to be rebuilt. My understanding is the estimates are at no point will rebuilding that entire nuclear deterrent require more than 7% of any year's defense budget. 7% for the foundation, 93% for the house that's built on it. It is essential that we maintain that credible deterrent, and it's got to be big enough to be credible so that a country like China does not think, they can build a few more weapons and get to parity with the United States. On the subject of BRAC, I do disagree with the gentleman from Washington on this point. 2 years ago, I specifically asked that we have included in the bill that was signed into law a requirement that the Pentagon provide us with an updated cost estimate on excess infrastructure. What we have all been citing is a 2004 estimate that there's about 20% excess infrastructure. 22% is the number that's often used. What we got back was 7 pages of nothing. And so I am very interested. By the way, that was not prohibited by the bill. It was required by the bill. What I am interested in is real, updated, data-driven study that shows whether we have excess infrastructure and of what sort. And I think that's exactly what Secretary Mattis said. Let me quote his exact sentence, quote, "I am not comfortable right now that we have a full 20-some% excess infrastructure. I need to go back through and look at this again because I don't want to get rid of something that we can't sustain and then say we got to go buy some land here in 10 years. So I think that's what we need is an updated study, and if it shows we've got excess infrastructure, I am not at all opposed to having another round of BRAC. I am very opposed to having another round like 2005, which I believe it's either CBO or GAO, I can't remember which, says has not yet broken even 12 years later. It still costs more money than it has, and has not started to save yet. So I don't want a repeat of that. I am interested if it shows that we do have excess infrastructure in a way to deal with that. Secretary Mattis, I believe, shares that view, but until we see the data, I'm not supportive
Would the gentleman yield for just
another round. Of course.
One quick second. So I think our bill doesn't quite get there. I mean, first of all, the bill has a prohibition on BRAC. It's not clear that it's got a prohibition on a study. But nor does it call for one. So as we get into conference, I think it might be a worthwhile thing to say that we ask, and I'm not sure if this is something the Defense Department can do without our authorization or not, but it's something that we should discuss as we get into conference to have them do that study. I think that would be an excellent first step that I'm not sure that we cover in this bill. Maybe we do, and we can figure that out over the course of the next 48 hours. But if it doesn't, that's something that I think we ought to try to do.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the point. I'm not convinced the gentleman and I really differ on this point. What the bill says now is nothing in this act shall be construed to authorize an additional base alignment enclosure round. That's what it says. It says we don't authorize it, of course. It does not prohibit a study to say whether we ought to, and I would welcome a real data-driven study that will help us reach that conclusion. Mr. Chairman, this is just further evidence that there's a wide range of issues and discussions to have in this bill, all for that purpose of supporting the men and women who serve our nation. I support en bloc package number 2. I urge my colleagues to, and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The question is on the amendments en bloc offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Any opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The en bloc amendments are agreed to.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to H.Res. 431, I offer a third package of amendments en bloc.
The clerk will designate the amendment en bloc pursuant to House Resolution 4.
On block number 3, consisting of amendments numbered 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, and 68, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Thornberry of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Thornberry, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I urge members to support en bloc package number 3 and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge members to support this en bloc package, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington yields back. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield as well.
Gentleman from Texas yields. Question is on the amendment block offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The en bloc amendment are agreed to.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to H.Res. 431, I offer a fourth package of amendments en bloc.
The clerk will designate the amendments en bloc.
On block number 4, consisting of amendments numbered 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, and 87, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212, offered by Mr. Thornberry of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Thornberry, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, will each control 10 minutes. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that amendment number 76 in Part B of House Report 115-212 be modified in the form I have placed at the desk.
The clerk will report the modification.
Modification to amendment number 76, printed in Part B of House Report number 115-212.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent the reading of the modification be dispensed with.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Is there objection to the gentleman's request? Without objection, the modification is agreed to. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I support this en bloc package and reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the en bloc package as well, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Texas.
I yield back the balance of the time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment en bloc as modified, offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The en bloc amendments as modified are agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2810, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2810 and has come to no resolution thereon. Chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leaves of absence requested for Mr. Guthrie of Kentucky for today and Mr. Khanna of California for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess subject to the call of the Chair.